It began with words, but it ended with trains, camps, and a plan to erase millions from history. In the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, amid the ruins of war and the machinery of totalitarian control, the policy that would later be called the final solution began to take shape. At first, it was laws, cold, calculated measures meant to separate neighbor from neighbor. Then came ghettos, where entire families were pressed into suffocating quarters, starved of food, freedom, and dignity. And as the war spread, so too did the boundaries of cruelty, until the language of bureaucracy was twisted into one of systematic destruction. In Berlin conference rooms, men in uniforms and tailored suits spoke not in shouts of anger, but in numbers, charts, and euphemisms. With chilling efficiency, they crafted a plan to erase entire peoples from the face of Europe. Behind every statistic was a human story, a mother holding her child, a father forced onto a train, an elder clutching memories of a lost world. From the forests of Eastern Europe to the barbed wire compounds scattered across the continent, the machinery of murder grew. Camps were built not to imprison, but to annihilate, their gates closing on millions who would never return. Railways became lifelines of death, carrying victims from cities and villages to places designed only for their destruction. And yet, even in the shadow of the gas chambers and firing squads, sparks of resistance glimmered. Prisoners smuggled notes, villagers hid families in their attics, and survivors would later give voice to what the perpetrators tried to erase. This is not only the story of a policy, but of the people who lived and died within its grip. The silence of those who looked away, the courage of those who resisted, and the enduring duty of memory. Tonight we will walk step by step through the history of the final solution, how it began, how it was carried out, and how its horrors were revealed to the world. And as you listen, I ask you to reflect, where are you tuning in from, and at what time of day? Whether in the quiet hours of night, or the first light of morning, let this be a moment to remember the past together, so it may never repeat. The seeds of genocide were not planted suddenly, but rather grew from centuries of poisonous beliefs that found their culmination in Nazi Germany. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in the early 1930s, he did not invent antisemitism, but he weaponized it with unprecedented political force. His worldview, deeply outlined in Mein Kampf, framed history as a struggle between races, with Jews portrayed as the eternal enemy of civilization. This pseudo-Darwinian interpretation of humanity insisted that survival depended on the elimination of those deemed inferior. Nazi ideology twisted the language of science and biology to give hatred a false legitimacy, presenting Jews not as a religious group, but as a dangerous parasitic race. In their propaganda, Jews were linked to disease, economic ruin, and cultural decay, poisoning German society from within. The Nazi vision was not merely about prejudice, it was about constructing a racial hierarchy with Aryans at the top. This obsession laid the intellectual groundwork for policies that moved steadily from exclusion to extermination. By casting Jews as an existential threat, the Nazis justified actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. The Jewish question, as they called it, became not just a political issue, but a matter of racial survival in their twisted logic. Hitler's obsession with the Jewish question consumed his politics and shaped the Nazi Party's agenda from its earliest days. He believed Germany's humiliation in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles were orchestrated by Jewish treachery, a conspiracy he tied to both communism and capitalism. This myth allowed him to position Jews as the hidden hand behind every national disaster, making them scapegoats for Germany's suffering. In his mind, eradicating Jews was not a secondary concern, but the central mission of his political life. Hitler framed the issue as one of destiny, Germany could not rise again unless it was purified of Jewish influence. He told his followers that this was not a matter of policy, but of survival, casting Jews as a mortal danger to the nation. This framing transformed anti-Semitism into a revolutionary call to arms, electrifying his audience with promises of renewal and vengeance. Hitler's speeches, amplified by the Nazi propaganda machine, hammered relentlessly on this point, ensuring that his obsession became the obsession of the masses. The Jewish question thus evolved into a national rallying cry. In this climate of hatred, the road to genocide was being paved with words long before it was built with gas chambers. Yet to understand how this rhetoric found fertile ground, one must look back at Europe's long and tragic history of anti-Semitism. Jews had faced centuries of exclusion, forced conversions, and violent pogroms across the continent. In medieval times, they were accused of blood libel, blamed for plagues, and barred from professions or property ownership. Even in the supposedly enlightened age of the 19th century, anti-Semitism remained embedded in European society. In Eastern Europe, particularly in the Russian Empire, organized pogroms left thousands of Jewish communities shattered. In the West, anti-Semitism took new forms, blending old religious prejudice with modern pseudoscience. France witnessed the Dreyfus Affair, where a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason, exposing deep-seated hostility. German thinkers and writers of the late 19th century contributed to racial theories that dehumanized Jews as a corrupting force. By the time the Nazis emerged, these ideas were not alien to the public, but deeply familiar. What Hitler offered was a radical intensification of long-standing hatred, dressed in the language of racial destiny and national rebirth. The Nazis transformed this old prejudice into a state ideology by claiming that Jews were not simply individuals with a religion, but a race locked in eternal conflict with Germans. This was a profound shift because it meant that no amount of conversion, assimilation, or loyalty could erase one's Jewish identity. A Jew was marked not by belief, but by blood, an indelible trait that could not be shed. This biological framing made coexistence impossible in the Nazi worldview, leaving only segregation or elimination as solutions. To spread this idea, the Nazis invested heavily in propaganda that saturated every aspect of German life. School textbooks taught racial science, children's stories depicted Jews as grotesque villains, and films portrayed them as scheming, corrupt figures. The message was unrelenting: Jews were parasites feeding off the body of the German nation. By convincing the population of this lie, the Nazis built a consensus of fear and suspicion. Every economic hardship or political failure could be blamed on this invisible enemy. Such dehumanization was a crucial step in making mass violence thinkable, even ordinary. At the heart of Nazi ideology was the myth of racial purity, a belief that the German Volk could only thrive if shielded from contamination. Hitler borrowed from eugenics movements spreading in the early 20th century, which promoted the sterilization of the unfit. In Nazi Germany, these ideas were radicalized to target entire peoples for destruction. Jews were cast as the ultimate contaminant, while other groups like the Roma, disabled, and Slavic populations were also deemed unworthy of life. The Nazis presented themselves as doctors curing a sick nation, with Jews as the disease to be eradicated. This metaphor made genocide appear like a form of medicine, a necessary operation to save Germany's future. Ordinary Germans were told that protecting their families meant supporting these measures, however brutal. Hitler's speeches echoed with language of cleansing, purging, and renewal, framing murder as salvation. It was a perverse inversion of morality, where killing was redefined as an act of preservation. By embedding these ideas into the national consciousness, the Nazis prepared society to accept and even endorse radical violence. The road to genocide was not only built on ideology, but also on the failure of opposition. Few challenged Hitler's growing extremism in the 1920s and 1930s, dismissing his rhetoric as fanatical but ultimately unserious. Political elites underestimated the resonance of his message, believing his movement would fade or could be controlled. Instead, his words struck a deep chord with a nation humiliated by war, economic collapse, and social unrest. The scapegoating of Jews offered simple answers to complex problems, a seductive illusion that gave people a target for their anger. Meanwhile, institutions that might have resisted were either silenced, co-opted, or dismantled. Churches, universities, and professional organizations bent under the weight of Nazi pressure. By the time the true implications of Hitler's racial obsessions were clear, it was too late. The regime had already fused anti-Semitism with nationalism, making opposition appear as betrayal. This silence and complicity allowed ideology to harden into policy, policy into action, and action into mass killing. The Nazi obsession with Jews also had a global dimension, tying them to conspiracies far beyond Germany's borders. Hitler claimed that Jews were behind both communism in the Soviet Union and capitalism in the United States, presenting them as orchestrators of a worldwide plot. This vision of a global Jewish enemy gave Nazi ideology a sense of urgency and inevitability. Germany was not fighting one minority group but defending itself against an international force of domination. Such thinking magnified the stakes, justifying the most radical solutions as defensive necessity. It also allowed the Nazis to frame their actions not as aggression but as preemptive survival. In speeches and writings, Hitler insisted that history was a racial war for control of the planet. Victory meant the annihilation of the Jewish people. Defeat meant Germany's destruction. This framing made compromise impossible and genocide inevitable. The final solution was presented not as choice but destiny, sealed long before the killing began. Thus, by the late 1930s, the road to genocide was paved with ideology, propaganda, and silence. Every element of Nazi thought reinforced the same conclusion that Jews could not live within the German world. Centuries of European prejudice had been sharpened into a racial doctrine of annihilation. Hitler's obsession with the Jewish question was not a passing fixation, but the central pillar of his regime. Through lies dressed as science, myths elevated as truth, and hatred disguised as patriotism, the Nazis built a worldview that demanded destruction. This worldview infected every level of society, from the classrooms of children to the speeches of ministers. It seeped into laws, policies, and eventually, the machinery of death. The path was laid not by chance, but by deliberate design, each step more radical than the last. By the time the world awoke to what was unfolding, the plan was already in motion. The ideology had become destiny, and destiny had turned to genocide. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, few could foresee the rapid transformation that would follow. The Nazi Party, once a fringe movement of angry nationalists, now stood at the threshold of total power. Hitler wasted no time in turning his position into a dictatorship, systematically dismantling the fragile democracy of the Weimar Republic. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire provided the pretext for emergency powers, allowing the Nazis to crush political opposition under the guise of protecting the nation. Civil liberties were suspended, newspapers silenced, and political gatherings outlawed. The Nazis declared that enemies lurked everywhere, from communists in the streets to Jews in businesses and universities. In reality, this was a calculated move to centralize control and silence dissent. Ordinary Germans awoke to find themselves in a new world, one where fear replaced debate and propaganda replaced truth. Hitler presented himself not as a politician, but as the embodiment of the German people's will. The takeover of 1933 was swift, decisive, and built on a foundation of terror and manipulation. From the very beginning, anti-Semitism was woven into the fabric of Nazi consolidation. Almost immediately, Jewish civil servants, professors, and judges were dismissed from their posts. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933 stripped Jews of positions in government and education. This law, presented as a measure to purify public service, sent a chilling message: Jews were no longer equal citizens but outsiders. The Nazis orchestrated a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st, plastering Star of David signs across storefronts and posting stormtroopers to intimidate customers. This marked the first coordinated attack on Jews under the Nazi state, cloaked in legality and justified as national defense. Propaganda posters portrayed Jews as greedy exploiters, undermining German society, further isolating them from neighbors and colleagues. These early measures were not random acts of violence, but deliberate steps toward exclusion. They tested the public's reaction and acclimated society to state-sponsored anti-Semitism. In this way, the regime made discrimination seem both ordinary and inevitable, laying the groundwork for harsher policies to come. The Nazi rise was not only political but cultural, as the regime sought to control the very ideas people consumed. On May 10, 1933, German university students, encouraged by their professors and the regime, staged massive book burnings in cities across the country. Works by Jewish authors, liberal thinkers, and political opponents were dragged into bonfires, cheered on by crowds chanting against un-German spirit. Entire libraries were purged of dangerous ideas, from Sigmund Freud to Albert Einstein, from Karl Marx to Heinrich Heine. The symbolism was powerful. Germany was purifying itself, cleansing the mind as it cleansed the nation. These fires lit the night sky, sending a clear message that dissenting voices would not be tolerated. For many, the sight was both terrifying and electrifying, a ritual of destruction that bound the regime to its followers. The book burnings were not spontaneous acts of students, but orchestrated spectacles of conformity. Through them, the Nazis cemented their dominance over culture and education. This control of thought was as critical to dictatorship as control of laws and armies. At the same time, the regime used mass rallies, radio broadcasts, and newspapers to weave its ideology into the daily lives of ordinary Germans. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a vast machine that transformed lies into unquestionable truths. Radios, subsidized by the state, poured Hitler's voice into living rooms, making his rhetoric a constant presence. Newspapers filled their pages with anti-Semitic caricatures, glorification of Aryan virtues, and vilification of enemies. The regime's visual propaganda was equally relentless, plastering cities with posters equating Jews with rats, disease, or Bolshevik conspirators. By controlling information, the Nazis controlled perception, and by controlling perception, they controlled reality. It became increasingly difficult for anyone to distinguish truth from lies, or rumor from fact. This manipulation created an atmosphere where anti-Semitism was not just accepted, but expected, part of daily life, as ordinary as bread and milk. Through saturation, the Nazi worldview became the German worldview. Every word spoken by Hitler or Goebbels reinforced the message that survival depended on exclusion. Anti-Semitism was not just a policy, it was the cornerstone of national rebirth. The dismantling of democracy was methodical, carried out under the appearance of legality. The Enabling Act passed in March 1933 gave Hitler the authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval, effectively ending constitutional government. With this single stroke, the Reichstag became irrelevant, reduced to a ceremonial rubber stamp. Political parties other than the Nazi Party were outlawed, dissolving the possibility of opposition. Trade unions were crushed, their leaders imprisoned, and workers forced into the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. The judiciary was restructured to serve Nazi interests, replacing impartial justice with loyalty to ideology. Every step was presented as a necessary defense against chaos, communism, or foreign influence. In reality, it was the systematic consolidation of total power. Anti-Semitism, meanwhile, remained central, framed as a patriotic duty to shield the nation from corruption. By binding legal authority with racial ideology, the Nazis created a state where persecution became the law itself. This merging of power and prejudice was the essence of the Nazi takeover. Hitler skillfully positioned himself as both a revolutionary and a restorer of German greatness. To the disillusioned masses, he promised order, employment, and pride after years of depression and instability. His regime launched grand public works projects, such as the Autobahn, to showcase progress and efficiency. Yet beneath this facade of prosperity was a darker agenda of exclusion and racial engineering. The successes of the Nazi economy were paraded as proof of Hitler's genius, while anti-Semitic measures were justified as part of the same national renewal. In speeches, Hitler linked prosperity with purity, claiming Germany's rise depended on the removal of Jews from its bloodstream. Crowds roared approval, seeing their own struggles dissolve into the promise of collective triumph. This blending of progress with persecution ensured that hatred seemed like common sense, not cruelty. Hitler's consolidation of power was thus not only political but emotional, tapping into national pride and fear simultaneously. By 1934, Germany was no longer a democracy, but a state fused entirely to Hitler's will. Violence also played a crucial role in securing Nazi authority. The SA, or brown shirts, terrorized opponents in the streets, breaking up meetings, attacking Jews, and intimidating voters. Their presence created an atmosphere of constant menace, ensuring that opposition remained invisible. Yet when the SA's power threatened Hitler's control, he turned on them during the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934. In a swift purge, Hitler ordered the execution of SA leaders and other political rivals, consolidating loyalty within the army and elite. This ruthless act demonstrated that Hitler's power was absolute, unchallenged by anyone inside or outside the party. At the same time, it reassured conservative elites that he could maintain order, making them more willing to support his regime. The SS under Heinrich Himmler rose to replace the SA as the backbone of terror, with precision and loyalty unmatched. This shift transformed Nazi violence from mob chaos to state-orchestrated repression. Antisemitism remained central to this violence, as Jews continued to be targeted both symbolically and physically. With power secured, Hitler now ruled Germany as both dictator and messiah figure. By the end of 1934, the rise of the Nazi state was complete, and its anti-Semitic core unmistakable. Hitler had eliminated political opposition, subordinated the press, controlled culture, and reshaped the law. Every organ of society, from schools to churches, felt the weight of Nazi ideology pressing upon it. Jews, once neighbors and colleagues, now found themselves isolated, unemployed, and vilified at every turn. The transformation of Germany into a racial state was not an accident, but the direct result of Hitler's vision. Antisemitism was not an afterthought, but the axis upon which the regime turned. By presenting exclusion as patriotism, the Nazis made persecution seem righteous, even necessary. Germans were told they were building a stronger, purer nation, and many believed it. The rise of the Nazi state was thus not only a seizure of power, but a reprogramming of society. What began with boycotts and book burnings would soon escalate into ghettos and gas chambers, for the road to genocide was already well paved. By 1935, the Nazi state had already isolated Jews from much of German public life, but Hitler and his inner circle wanted something more permanent. They sought to anchor anti-Semitism not in mob violence or propaganda alone, but in the very structure of law. At the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, a spectacle designed to showcase power and unity, Hitler unveiled a new set of decrees that would formalize exclusion. These would come to be known as the Nuremberg laws, and they redefined who could be German and who could not. With a stroke of the pen, Jewish existence in Germany was stripped of legal recognition. Citizenship, once guaranteed under the Weimar Constitution, was now revoked for anyone classified as Jewish. Instead, Jews were relegated to subjects of the state, dependent on the will of the regime, without political rights. This legal shift was monumental, transforming discrimination into codified exclusion. It sent a chilling message to Jews across Germany. They were no longer citizens, no longer part of the national body, but aliens within their own homeland. The Nazi racial vision was now embedded in the machinery of the state. The Nuremberg laws consisted of two core pieces of legislation: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. The Reich Citizenship Law defined Jews as outsiders by blood, regardless of their personal beliefs, loyalty, or service to Germany. No act of patriotism or assimilation could undo the mark of ancestry. Meanwhile, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor outlawed marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. It even forbade Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 to prevent supposed racial contamination. These laws reached into the private sphere of families, dictating who could marry, love, or even interact intimately. Bureaucrats, clerks, and officials now became guardians of racial purity, examining ancestry charts with clinical precision. Genealogy offices swelled with activity as people attempted to prove their Aryan status. For Jews, this meant every relationship, every document, and every social interaction became a site of surveillance and control. What had once been prejudice was now enshrined as unbreakable law. The process of classification was meticulous and cruel, reducing human identity to bureaucratic categories. Jews were defined not by faith, but by the religion of their grandparents. If 3 or 4 grandparents were Jewish, an individual was automatically designated a Jew, regardless of personal practice or belief. Those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were classified as Mischling, or mixed blood, divided into first and second degree. These categories determined whether one could attend school, hold a job, or marry freely. Families that had lived as Germans for generations suddenly found themselves branded as alien. Soldiers who had fought for Germany in World War I, doctors who had healed communities, and teachers who had shaped young minds were all stripped of recognition. The state reduced centuries of assimilation and contribution into a mathematical formula of ancestry. Entire family trees were scrutinized, with identities dissected like specimens in a laboratory. It was bureaucracy turned into a weapon of persecution, cold, methodical, and devastating. Segregation extended beyond law books into visible markers of identity. Jews were forbidden from displaying the German flag or colors, though they were permitted, cynically, to display the yellow and blue of the Jewish community. This served not as recognition but as humiliation, forcing Jews to signal their separation from the national body. Over time, additional decrees mandated identity cards stamped with a red J and the adoption of the names Israel and Sarah for Jewish men and women. These measures stripped individuals of privacy and dignity, branding them as outsiders wherever they went. It became impossible to blend in, impossible to hide, impossible to escape the stigma. The Nazis engineered a society where Jews were visibly marked, both legally and socially, as different. This branding was not merely symbolic, it prepared society for deeper exclusion and eventual deportation. Neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers could now instantly identify Jews on the street. Such segregation ensured that the boundaries between German and Jew were permanent, unbridgeable, and enforced at every level of life. The Nuremberg laws had a devastating psychological impact on the Jewish population. People who had once thought of themselves as German patriots, veterans, or intellectuals suddenly realized that the state no longer recognized their humanity. Children were expelled from schools, their friendships severed by official decree. Professionals who had spent decades building careers were disbarred, dismissed, and shunned. Marriages that crossed racial lines were annulled, tearing families apart. The laws attacked the very fabric of personal identity, telling Jews they were not only excluded, but unworthy of belonging. For many, the betrayal was especially painful because they had embraced German culture so fully, seeing themselves as part of its history and future. Instead, they were pushed into ghettos of the mind, where fear, shame, and despair replaced security and dignity. These laws did not kill, but they prepared minds, German and Jewish alike, for the possibility of destruction. They stripped Jews of hope, eroded bonds of community, and left them increasingly vulnerable to what was to come. The trauma was immediate, and its scars would last a lifetime. For the Nazi regime, the Nuremberg laws were not only about Jews but about consolidating loyalty among Germans. By defining Jews as the enemy within, the regime bound Aryans together as members of a racial community. Ordinary Germans were invited to participate in this division, whether through denunciations, compliance, or silence. Employers dismissed Jewish workers, schools expelled Jewish children, and landlords refused Jewish tenants. This made persecution appear not only as government policy, but as social consensus. To refuse participation was to risk suspicion or punishment, ensuring conformity. The regime cloaked this exclusion in language of purity and national pride, making hatred feel like civic duty. Each decree, each boycott, each restriction normalized anti-Semitism further. Germans were told that by excluding Jews, they were defending their nation, families, and future. The laws created not just a segregated society, but a society complicit in segregation. Internationally, the Nuremberg laws revealed the Nazi regime's true intentions to the world, though few took decisive action. Some foreign newspapers condemned the laws as barbaric, while others dismissed them as internal German matters. Many nations still reeling from the Great Depression were reluctant to confront Hitler directly. Even within Germany, there was little organized resistance. Instead, many accepted or ignored the exclusion of their Jewish neighbors. The regime carefully staged the announcement of the laws at the Nuremberg rally, using spectacle to mask brutality. Hitler presented the measures as necessary to protect German blood and honor, cloaking persecution in patriotism. The world saw the pageantry, the torch-lit marches, and the disciplined crowds more clearly than the suffering of Jews. By manipulating appearances, the Nazis minimized outrage and avoided serious consequences. Silence abroad, like silence at home, emboldened the regime to go further. What began as exclusion would soon evolve into persecution of an entirely different scale. By institutionalizing anti-Semitism through the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis crossed a critical threshold on the road to genocide. No longer were Jews merely the targets of propaganda or mob attacks. They were now legally stripped of rights and excluded from the national community. This made every subsequent step from segregation to deportation, from ghettos to extermination, appear like a natural progression. The laws hardened the categories of identity that would later determine life or death. They prepared bureaucrats, police, and ordinary citizens to see Jews not as neighbors but as enemies to be managed. With every identity card stamped, every family separated, and every right revoked, the machinery of destruction gained momentum. The Nazis had shown that ideology could be codified, and once codified, it could not easily be reversed. Jews were left stateless in their own homeland, trapped between humiliation and despair. The Nuremberg laws were not the end of persecution, but the legal foundation for annihilation. On this foundation, the final solution would soon be built. On the night of November 9th, 1938, Germany erupted in a wave of orchestrated violence that would forever be remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. What began as scattered attacks quickly swelled into a nationwide pogrom, striking at the very heart of Jewish life. Across German cities and towns, synagogues burned in flames that lit the night sky, while fire brigades stood by, instructed only to protect neighboring Aryan buildings. Storefronts owned by Jewish families were smashed with hammers and axes, their windows shattered into glittering shards that gave the pogrom its chilling name. Crowds gathered, some participating, others watching silently as the destruction unfolded. The violence was not spontaneous rage, but carefully directed, ordered by Nazi leaders to unleash terror under the guise of revenge. By morning, streets lay covered in glass, sacred sites reduced to ash, and businesses looted beyond recognition. The physical devastation, though immense, was only part of the assault. The psychological blow to Jews was far deeper. For the first time, Jews across Germany realized they were utterly unprotected, exposed to the brutality of the state itself. Kristallnacht marked the moment when exclusion gave way to open violence sanctioned at the highest level. The official pretext for Kristallnacht was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst von Rath, by a young Jewish refugee named Herschel Grinspen. His desperate act, motivated by the deportation and suffering of his family, was seized by the Nazis as justification for mass retaliation. In truth, the regime had long been preparing for such an opportunity, waiting for the spark to ignite its plan. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, stood before a rally on November 9th and declared that the German people should take spontaneous action against Jews. Behind the rhetoric of spontaneity was careful coordination, with orders issued to stormtroopers and police across the Reich. Instructions were clear: destroy Jewish property, burn synagogues, arrest men, but avoid looting for personal gain. The violence was designed to appear like a national uprising, when in fact it was a state-orchestrated pogrom. The careful orchestration revealed the cold precision behind the chaos. What unfolded was not the rage of a mob, but the machinery of a dictatorship testing its limits. The Grinspen incident was a spark. Kristallnacht was the explosion the Nazis had always intended. As the night of terror swept across Germany and Austria, synagogues became prime targets of destruction. Nearly 300 houses of worship were burned, desecrated, or demolished, some centuries old, their history erased in a single night. Sacred scrolls, prayer books, and religious artifacts were hurled into flames or trampled in the streets. The destruction of synagogues was more than physical ruin. It was an assault on the spiritual lifeblood of Jewish communities. For many Jews, seeing their sacred spaces annihilated under the eyes of neighbors was a trauma beyond words. The flames of Kristallnacht were meant not only to destroy buildings, but to annihilate memory, tradition, and dignity. Firefighters, present in many towns, were ordered to ensure the flames did not spread to Aryan-owned properties, allowing Jewish sites to burn unchecked. The calculated indifference of state institutions revealed the complicity of the regime at every level. Across the Reich, the night echoed with the crackling of flames, the smashing of glass, and the screams of terrorized families. The air itself became heavy with smoke and hatred, announcing a new phase of persecution. Jewish businesses bore the brunt of the pogrom's fury, their storefronts shattered and interiors gutted by mobs. Nearly 7,500 shops were destroyed, many left looted and unusable, their owners reduced to ruin overnight. The Nazis cynically portrayed these attacks as the righteous anger of the German people, but the reality was an organized campaign of economic destruction. The glass-covered streets became a cruel symbol of broken livelihoods and shattered security. Families who had built businesses over generations now stood helpless, watching their futures vanish under blows of hatred. Insurance companies, under Nazi orders, refused to compensate Jews for damages, forcing victims to absorb the costs of their own destruction. To make matters worse, the regime imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, holding them financially responsible for the violence inflicted upon them. This transformed Kristallnacht into both a physical and economic assault, stripping Jews of their wealth alongside their dignity. The pogrom was not only about hatred, it was about erasing Jewish existence from the economic fabric of Germany. What remained was poverty, humiliation, and despair, imposed with deliberate cruelty. The violence of Kristallnacht extended into the intimate safety of homes. Jewish families awoke to shouts, pounding fists, and the crash of shattered doors. Men were dragged into the streets, beaten in front of wives and children, their homes vandalized beyond recognition. Furniture was overturned, belongings smashed, and personal mementos destroyed in acts of deliberate humiliation. In many towns, neighbors who had once shared greetings stood by silently, some even pointing out Jewish residences to the attackers. The sense of betrayal was profound, as trust in community dissolved overnight. Women and children were left traumatized, their fathers and brothers hauled away by police and stormtroopers. The pogrom turned private life into a battlefield, erasing the boundary between home and hostility. For Jews there was no longer any place of refuge, no safe space untouched by the regime's hatred. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a site of terror sanctioned by the state. One of the most devastating consequences of Kristallnacht was the mass arrest of Jewish men. Over 30,000 were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. This was the first time that Jewish men were detained in such large numbers, signaling a new phase of persecution. Many endured brutal treatment, forced into hard labor, beaten, and subjected to horrific conditions. Some never returned, dying from abuse, malnutrition, or exhaustion. The arrests served a dual purpose. They terrorized Jewish families, while also testing the capacity of the concentration camp system. For many Jews, Kristallnacht revealed the terrifying reality that persecution was escalating beyond humiliation into physical imprisonment. The camps, once places of political repression, now expanded into instruments of racial persecution. Families left behind were paralyzed by fear, uncertain if their loved ones would survive. The mass arrests marked a turning point where Nazi intentions could no longer be doubted. The psychological impact of Kristallnacht was profound and irreversible. For German Jews, it shattered the illusion that things might improve, or that persecution could be endured through resilience. The pogrom demonstrated that there was no safety, no protection, and no path to coexistence under the Nazi regime. It sent shockwaves through Jewish communities, igniting despair, panic, and a desperate search for escape. In the days that followed, emigration offices were flooded with pleas from Jews seeking to leave Germany, though most nations closed their doors. The international response was muted, with condemnations issued but little action taken. For Jews, this silence confirmed their isolation, deepening their vulnerability. Kristallnacht became a moment of realization. Persecution was no longer about exclusion, but destruction. The broken glass reflected not only shattered windows, but the broken future of an entire people. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of the road to annihilation. In the aftermath, the Nazis presented Kristallnacht as a moment of justice, twisting reality to suit their narrative. The state-controlled press claimed that the German people had expressed righteous indignation, though the violence had been ordered from above. International outrage, though present, did little to alter the regime's course, emboldening Hitler and his followers further. For the Jewish community, the aftermath was a world of ashes, debts, and fear, with synagogues in ruins, businesses gone, and thousands of men imprisoned. The pogrom revealed the terrifying truth that anti-Semitism was no longer a matter of discrimination, but a program of destruction enforced by law, violence, and silence. Kristallnacht was a rehearsal for genocide, a public test of how far the regime could go without meaningful resistance. It silenced hope, isolated victims, and confirmed to perpetrators that the world would not intervene. The night of November 9th, 1938, became a turning point not only in German history, but in human history. From this point forward, the path to the final solution was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. The shards of broken glass pointed directly toward the gates of Auschwitz. On September 1st, 1939, the thunder of artillery and the roar of German tanks announced the dawn of a new era of violence. Germany's invasion of Poland was swift, ruthless, and devastating, marking the official outbreak of the Second World War. Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, combined air power, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming speed to crush Polish defenses within weeks. For the Jewish population of Poland, numbering over 3 million, the invasion brought immediate terror and displacement. German soldiers, accompanied by SS units, descended upon towns and villages with brutality, looting homes and humiliating Jewish residents. Anti-Jewish decrees followed swiftly, forcing Jews to wear armbands, endure curfews, and surrender property. Polish cities that had long been vibrant centers of Jewish culture suddenly became arenas of fear and oppression. Synagogues were desecrated, schools closed, and entire communities reduced to despair in the shadow of occupation. The war allowed Nazi racial ideology to extend beyond Germany's borders, transforming anti-Semitism from domestic persecution into an international policy. In the smoke and rubble of Poland, the seeds of genocide began to take root in new soil. The invasion of Poland provided the Nazis with a vast laboratory for radical policies that had not yet been possible within Germany alone. Under the general government established by Hans Frank, occupied Poland became a testing ground for racial experiments and administrative cruelty. Jews were stripped of property, forced into ghettos, and subjected to arbitrary violence by soldiers and police. Local populations, caught between German occupiers and their own survival, often participated in the harassment and denunciation of Jews. The sheer scale of Poland's Jewish community overwhelmed the Nazis' previous methods of control, forcing them to seek new, more radical solutions. Forced labor became widespread, with Jews compelled to work under brutal conditions for the German war machine. Families were torn apart as men, women, and children were dispatched to different labor sites or confined within makeshift camps. These measures were no longer about segregation alone, but about exploitation and dehumanization on a massive scale. Every street corner, every checkpoint, every uniform reminded Jews that their lives were now at the mercy of occupiers who considered them subhuman. In Poland, the brutality of war and the ideology of race merged into a single terrifying reality. The chaos of conquest allowed the SS and police to unleash violence that blurred the line between military operations and racial annihilation. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army into Poland, tasked with eliminating potential enemies of the Reich. Officially, their targets included political leaders, intellectuals, and resistance fighters. But Jews were singled out from the very beginning. Executions took place in town squares, forests, and fields, often in full view of local populations. Men were lined up against walls and shot, while women and children were subjected to beatings, humiliation, and expulsion. Mass graves began to scar the Polish countryside, silent evidence of crimes carried out in the name of racial purification. These killings were framed as security measures, but their true purpose was to terrorize and destroy entire communities. The speed and scale of these actions shocked even some German officials, who reported back on the efficiency and brutality of the campaigns. For Jews, the invasion was not just an occupation but an apocalypse descending upon their lives. The Einsatzgruppen's actions foreshadowed the industrialized killings that would soon follow. At the same time, the Nazi regime intensified its legal and social restrictions within occupied territories. Jews were forced to register, their identities catalogued with chilling precision. Armbands bearing the Star of David became compulsory, branding individuals with a mark of shame visible to all. This segregation made Jews vulnerable to harassment, violence, and arbitrary arrest at every turn. Markets, shops, and public spaces became sites of exclusion, where Jews could no longer participate in daily life. The Nazis sought to erase Jews from public existence while exploiting their labor for the German war effort. Curfews confined families to their homes, while restrictions on movement fractured communities and severed vital connections. Every law and decree reinforced the notion that Jews were outsiders, unwanted, and despised. Yet beyond the cruelty of exclusion lay the growing shadow of annihilation, hinted at in the whispers of soldiers and the brutality of police raids. The war created conditions where cruelty could expand unchecked, moving persecution into the realm of systematic destruction. With every new decree, the distance between exclusion and extermination grew smaller. The ghettos of occupied Poland became grim symbols of Nazi radicalization. Cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow saw entire Jewish populations forced into overcrowded, walled districts cut off from the rest of society. Within these ghettos, disease, starvation, and despair spread rapidly as families struggled to survive in inhuman conditions. Food rations were deliberately set at starvation levels, ensuring malnutrition and death became routine. Smuggling food became an act of courage and defiance, with children risking their lives to bring bread or potatoes through cracks in the walls. The ghettos also became centers of cultural resilience, where schools, theaters, and religious services continued in secret despite the oppression. Yet even in this resistance, the crushing reality of Nazi control loomed constantly. German guards patrolled the perimeters, ready to shoot anyone who attempted to escape. For For many Jews, the ghettos were both prisons and waiting rooms for death, their walls closing in with each passing day. The very existence of ghettos signaled that Jews were no longer tolerated within society, but confined, controlled, and prepared for an unknown fate. The war had transformed anti-Semitism from segregation into incarceration. The occupation of Poland also intensified the Nazis' broader vision of racial conquest. Hitler declared that the war in the East was not merely a military campaign, but a racial struggle for survival. Poles and other Slavic peoples were treated as inferior, subject to forced labor, mass displacement, and executions. For Jews, the treatment was even harsher, as they were portrayed as the root of all opposition and the ultimate threat to German dominance. Nazi propaganda framed the war as a crusade against Jewish Bolshevism, blaming Jews for communism and resistance alike. This framing justified the most brutal actions, presenting genocide as a form of self-defense. Soldiers and civilians alike were indoctrinated with the belief that cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary. The brutality of the Eastern Campaign hardened attitudes, normalizing violence against entire populations. In this context, the leap from persecution to extermination seemed less radical, more like an extension of the war itself. The occupation was not only territorial expansion, but ideological fulfillment, where racial hatred became inseparable from military strategy. Poland thus became the crucible, where war and genocide fused into a single inseparable mission. As the war spread beyond Poland, the persecution of Jews expanded across Europe with terrifying efficiency. Wherever the German army advanced, anti-Semitic decrees followed, enforced by SS units, local collaborators, and bureaucrats. In Austria, Czechoslovakia, and France, Jews were stripped of property, excluded from professions, and targeted for deportation. Yet in Poland, the intensity of persecution revealed the Nazis' ultimate ambitions. The sheer scale of the Jewish population forced the regime to confront what it called the Jewish question in practical terms. This confrontation did not lead to moderation, but to radicalization, as leaders like Himmler and Heydrich pushed for increasingly violent solutions. Conferences and reports began to discuss the future of Jews not in terms of coexistence, but removal, relocation, and destruction. War gave cover to these discussions, creating a climate where atrocities could be committed under the guise of military necessity. For the Jews of occupied Europe, the expansion of war meant the expansion of terror. Every new conquest brought the machinery of persecution closer to its ultimate conclusion. By the end of 1939, the outbreak of war had fundamentally transformed the Nazi project. What had begun as a program of exclusion within Germany had become a campaign of destruction across the continent. The invasion of Poland revealed both the brutality of Nazi ideology and the willingness of the regime to escalate violence without restraint. Ghettos, forced labor, executions, and mass arrests foreshadowed the horrors yet to come. The distinction between military conquest and racial annihilation grew increasingly blurred, each reinforcing the other in a cycle of radicalization. For Jews, the war meant not only the loss of homes and livelihoods, but the onset of systematic destruction. Their existence was now threatened not by laws alone, but by guns, camps, and starvation policies. The international community, distracted by the expanding conflict, failed to grasp the magnitude of the unfolding catastrophe. Inside occupied Poland, however, the reality was unmistakable. The road from discrimination to genocide had been crossed, and the final solution was no longer a distant possibility, but a looming certainty. In the wake of the 1939 invasion of Poland, the Nazi regime confronted the reality of controlling millions of Jews spread across cities, towns, and villages. The solution they devised was the ghetto system, a brutal form of segregation designed to isolate Jews from the rest of the population. Ghettos were walled or fenced districts within urban centers, sealed off with checkpoints, barbed wire, or wooden barriers. Families were forced from their homes with little notice, allowed to carry only what they could hold in their hands. Polish cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow became epicenters of this policy, their Jewish quarters transformed into prisons. The ghettos were presented as temporary measures, but in reality they were death traps designed to degrade, starve, and eventually annihilate their inhabitants. By corralling Jews into confined spaces, the Nazis ensured control while creating conditions of despair and disease. The ghettos were crowded beyond imagination, with multiple families crammed into single apartments or makeshift shelters. Streets once filled with life and commerce, now echoed with hunger, fear, and silence. In these confined spaces, the Jewish population endured a slow, deliberate suffocation under Nazi rule. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of all, quickly became a symbol of both suffering and endurance. Established in October 1940, it enclosed over 400,000 Jews within an area of just a few square miles. Walls topped with barbed wire and guarded by armed patrols severed its residents from the outside world. Conditions inside were catastrophic. Food rations were deliberately set at starvation levels, with Jews allowed only a fraction of the calories allotted to Germans. Malnutrition was immediate, with children collapsing in the streets and adults wasting away from hunger. Disease spread rapidly, as overcrowding and unsanitary conditions fueled epidemics of typhus and tuberculosis. Corpses lay uncollected in alleys, a grim testament to the daily toll of deprivation. Smuggling food into the ghetto became an act of survival, carried out by children who slipped through cracks and holes in the walls. Despite the risks, these smuggling networks sustained thousands of lives, though never enough to stem the tide of death. The Warsaw Ghetto was both a cage and a crucible, where despair and resilience coexisted in agonizing proximity. In Lodz, the ghetto reflected another dimension of Nazi cruelty: exploitation through forced labor. Established in April 1940, the Lodz ghetto confined nearly 200,000 Jews under the authority of German overseers and a Jewish council led by Mordecai Chaim-Rumkowski. Factories sprouted within the ghetto, producing uniforms, boots, and other goods for the German war effort. Jews were reduced to industrial slaves, working long hours under harsh conditions for meager rations that barely sustained life. Rumkowski, controversial and deeply criticized, believed that survival depended on proving Jewish usefulness to the Nazis. His calls for compliance and sacrifice, including the surrender of children during deportations, remain among the most painful episodes of ghetto history. Despite his efforts, the Lodz ghetto became a site of mass starvation, exploitation, and eventual deportation to death camps. Families watched loved ones vanish into trains, never to return. The ghetto's bleak endurance until 1944, one of the longest to exist, testified to both human resilience and the futility of appeasing an extermination regime. In Lodz, labor was not salvation, it was slow-motion destruction wrapped in false hope. The Krakow ghetto, established in 1941, illustrated the violence and humiliation that accompanied Nazi segregation. Thousands of Jews were forced into a walled district, their homes seized and redistributed to German settlers. Daily life was punctuated by terror, as SS patrols raided homes, beat residents, and staged executions in public squares. Hunger gnawed at families, as rations dwindled and smuggling routes were heavily policed. In March 1943, the ghetto was liquidated in a wave of violence that left hundreds dead and thousands deported to extermination camps like Belzec and Auschwitz. Survivors recalled the screams of children torn from their mothers' arms, the smoke of burning homes, and the relentless gunfire echoing through the streets. The liquidation revealed the true function of the ghettos. They were not permanent enclosures, but way stations to death. Every Jewish community confined in this way faced the same fate, whether by starvation inside the walls or deportation beyond them. The Krakow ghetto's end was as brutal as its existence, a microcosm of the final solution in action. Its memory lives on as a stark reminder of systematic cruelty disguised as policy. Hunger and disease became the unrelenting companions of ghetto life, claiming lives with merciless efficiency. Children, the most vulnerable, suffered swollen bellies and skeletal frames as malnutrition consumed their small bodies. Adults wasted away too weak to work or even stand, their strength eroded by months of deprivation. Epidemics swept through the ghettos, spread by lice, contaminated water, and overcrowding. Doctors and nurses struggled to provide care, often without medicine, equipment, or food to aid recovery. Many recorded their observations in secret journals, preserving evidence of the suffering and the systematic nature of Nazi cruelty. Corpses became part of the streetscape, collected daily by carts that moved through alleys like grim reminders of mortality. Families learned to live with grief as loved ones vanished to hunger, disease, or deportation. Death was constant, yet so normalized that children grew up surrounded by its presence. The ghettos were engineered spaces of slow death, each rule and restriction carefully calibrated to erase life without bullets or gas. Yet, even in these conditions of despair, cultural and spiritual resistance endured. Secret schools were organized to educate children despite the risks of discovery. Underground libraries circulated books, allowing people to cling to knowledge and identity even as their world collapsed. Religious leaders held clandestine services, defying Nazi prohibitions by sustaining faith through prayer and ritual. Theaters, musical performances, and poetry readings offered brief escapes from hunger and fear. Writers and intellectuals documented daily life in diaries, notebooks, and archives, preserving a record of suffering for the future. The most famous of these efforts was the Ringelblum Archive in Warsaw, a secret collection of testimonies, documents, and essays buried in milk cans and tin boxes beneath the ghetto. Its authors knew they might not survive, but they believed history must know what happened. These acts of cultural defiance were themselves forms of resistance, asserting humanity in the face of dehumanization. Even as bodies weakened, spirits resisted through memory, culture, and creativity. The ghettos thus became sites not only of despair, but also of enduring dignity. Smuggling networks and underground resistance groups also challenged Nazi control from within the ghettos. Children as young as 8 risked their lives crawling through holes in walls or slipping past guards to bring food back to their families. Entire families relied on these tiny heroes, whose bravery often determined whether they lived another day. Resistance groups formed, distributing clandestine newspapers and coordinating with underground movements outside the ghettos. Weapons were smuggled in preparation for uprisings that, though doomed to fail, demonstrated a refusal to submit. These networks operated under constant threat of discovery, torture, and execution, yet they persisted in defiance of Nazi terror. Acts of resistance extended beyond violence to include the preservation of memory and solidarity. Every smuggled loaf of bread, every hidden prayer, every secret lesson was a declaration of survival against annihilation. Resistance did not erase the despair, but it reminded both oppressors and oppressed that Jewish spirit remained unbroken. Even in cages, defiance flickered like embers refusing to be extinguished. The ghettos, though designed to suffocate, also incubated courage in its purest form. By the time the ghettos were liquidated, their purpose was undeniable. They were instruments of genocide disguised as urban policy. Warsaw's uprising in 1943, Lodzi's deportations in 1944, and Krakow's liquidation in 1943 revealed the grim destiny that awaited every Jewish ghetto. They were never intended as permanent settlements, but as holding pens for eventual extermination. The hunger, disease, and forced labor were tools to weaken populations, preparing them for deportation and death. For the Nazis, ghettos solved the logistical challenge of containment until more final measures could be enacted. For Jews, they were spaces of torment, despair, resilience, and unimaginable loss. The ghettos became symbols of cruelty on a scale that defied comprehension, where humanity was stripped yet dignity refused to vanish entirely. Their legacy endures through testimonies, archives, and the memory of those who resisted even in the face of certain death. They reveal the depths of cruelty the human mind can design, and the heights of resilience the human spirit can reach. In the ghettos of despair, the shadow of the final solution grew darker, preparing the way for the abyss that was to follow. On June 22, 1941, the German army launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, sending millions of troops across the Soviet frontier. Behind the Wehrmacht's armored divisions and infantry columns followed special units tasked with a darker mission. These were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads composed of SS officers, security police, and local auxiliaries. Their orders were chillingly clear: to eliminate Jews, communists, partisans, and anyone deemed a threat to German rule. Unlike ghettos or deportations, the Einsatzgruppen brought death directly to communities, turning villages and fields into killing grounds. Jews were rounded up, marched to ravines, forests, or pits, and executed en masse with rifles and machine guns. These massacres were not random acts of brutality, but systematic operations coordinated with military advances. Entire communities disappeared in days, their existence erased with the pull of a trigger. The invasion of the Soviet Union transformed persecution into outright annihilation, bringing the Holocaust into its bloodiest phase. In the East, ideology and war fused into one, and the Einsatzgruppen became the spearhead of genocide. The scale and organization of the Einsatzgruppen revealed the cold precision of Nazi policy. There were four main groups: Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D, each assigned to a region of the advancing front. They were supported by local collaborators, auxiliary police, and even regular German soldiers, who sometimes participated in the killings. Reports were meticulously filed back to Berlin, detailing the number of Jews and other victims murdered, as though recording statistics of production rather than human lives. Within the first year of the invasion, more than 500,000 Jews were slaughtered by these squads. Villages were emptied, synagogues desecrated, and bodies left in shallow graves. This was not hidden violence, but often public, carried out in view of local populations to instill terror and eliminate resistance. The bureaucratic tone of reports belied the horror unfolding on the ground, reducing communities to numbers erased in ink. For the perpetrators, this methodical approach gave genocide the appearance of administrative duty. For the victims, it was the sudden collapse of existence, the transformation of home into grave. The Einsatzgruppen were not merely soldiers, they were executioners of ideology. One of the most infamous massacres, orchestrated by the Einsatzgruppen, took place at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. On September 29, 1941, more than 33,000 Jews were marched to the site under orders of German authorities. Families carried belongings, believing they were being resettled, unaware of the fate awaiting them. At the edge of the ravine, victims were forced to strip naked, their clothes and valuables confiscated. They were then lined up and shot in waves, their bodies tumbling into the pit below. Over 2 days the ravine was filled with corpses, layer upon layer of men, women, and children. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hills, a symphony of death orchestrated by Nazi command. Babi Yar was not an isolated atrocity, but emblematic of hundreds of similar massacres across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Each site became a scar on the landscape, silent yet enduring testimony to systematic slaughter. In the shadow of Babi Yar, the final solution was already being carried out with bullets. The brutality of the massacres was compounded by their intimacy. Unlike the gas chambers that would later define the Holocaust, these killings required face-to-face execution. Perpetrators looked directly at their victims, heard their cries, and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. Children clutched their mothers, elders prayed, and entire families died together in ditches. For the killers, this proximity took a psychological toll, leading some to drink heavily or suffer breakdowns. To manage this, commanders sought ways to streamline the process, experimenting with gas vans and more impersonal methods of execution. Yet, even before mechanization, the Einsatzgruppen had already proven the Nazi regime's capacity for mass murder. These shootings were not the result of chaos, but of orders, discipline, and planning. The victims' final moments were defined by helplessness, humiliation, and unimaginable terror. In these killing fields, humanity itself seemed to vanish, replaced by cold efficiency and calculated cruelty. The local populations played a complex role in these massacres, sometimes complicit, sometimes horrified. In many regions, centuries of antisemitism made it easier for collaborators to assist the Germans. Auxiliary police forces, recruited from Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and others, often rounded up Jews, guarded perimeters, or even carried out executions. Some civilians looted Jewish homes after the killings, seizing furniture, clothing, and valuables left behind. Others, however, were shocked by the scale of the violence and recoiled in fear or silence. Very few attempted to intervene, as the risk of death for helping Jews was immense. The Nazis exploited local divisions, fueling resentment and hatred to secure cooperation. This collaboration made the killings faster, more thorough, and more devastating. For Jews, the betrayal of neighbors compounded the horror of Nazi violence, stripping away the last threads of community trust. The Einsatzgruppen thrived in this climate of fear, hatred, and opportunism. Their efficiency depended not only on German command, but also on local complicity. The psychological landscape of the killers was shaped by ideology and indoctrination. Many were educated men, lawyers, doctors, and academics, who had embraced Nazi racial theories. They justified their actions as part of a historic mission, eliminating what they believed was a biological threat to Germany's survival. Some claimed obedience to orders, others reveled in their power, and still others rationalized the killings as wartime necessity. The language of reports reflected this mindset, referring to massacres as special actions or cleansings. By masking murder in bureaucratic euphemisms, perpetrators distanced themselves from the human reality of their crimes. Alcohol, camaraderie, and the normalization of violence further numbed their consciences. Yet not all participated willingly. Some sought transfers, though few openly refused. The system was designed to ensure obedience, punishing dissent, and rewarding zeal. In this environment, mass murder became routine, and atrocity became a career. The Einsatzgruppen were proof of how ideology, authority, and circumstance could transform ordinary men into agents of genocide. For the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, the arrival of the Einsatzgruppen was nothing short of apocalyptic. Villages emptied overnight, with residents marched to their deaths under the gaze of soldiers and neighbors. Survivors described the terror of being herded into trucks, courtyards, or forests, surrounded by armed men who showed no mercy. Mothers tried to shield their children. Rabbis carried Torah scrolls into their final moments, and entire families clung together until the end. The scale of loss was incomprehensible, with towns that had thrived for centuries wiped out in hours. Survivors who escaped spoke of rivers running red with blood and fields filled with unmarked graves. For those left behind, the silence of absence was almost worse than the killings themselves. Communities disappeared without trace, their synagogues abandoned, their cemeteries desecrated, their names erased from history books. What had once been centers of Jewish life became empty shells haunted by memory. The Einsatzgruppen left behind not only bodies, but the void of annihilated culture. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered more than 1 million Jews across the Soviet territories. These massacres represented the Holocaust in its rawest form, personal, brutal, and immediate. The killing fields of Babi Yar, Ponary, and countless unnamed ravines foreshadowed the industrial extermination that was soon to follow. They proved that genocide was not a distant plan, but an unfolding reality, carried out village by village, grave by grave. The efficiency of the squads demonstrated the regime's resolve to eradicate Jewish life wherever it could be found. Yet the psychological burden on the killers and the logistical challenges of shooting thousands at a time convinced Nazi leaders to seek more efficient methods. From the ashes of these massacres emerged the push toward gas chambers and extermination camps. The Einsatzgruppen were thus both the beginning and the bridge, transforming ideology into mass murder and paving the way for industrial genocide. Their legacy remains in the silent ravines and unmarked graves scattered across Eastern Europe. In those killing fields, the full horror of the final solution was first made real. By late 1941, the course of Nazi policy had moved from persecution to extermination, driven by the radicalization of war in the East. The invasion of the Soviet Union had unleashed unprecedented violence, with the Einsatzgruppen murdering entire Jewish communities in forests and ravines. Yet even this scale of killing presented challenges, logistical, psychological, and bureaucratic, that demanded new methods. German leaders began to debate how to make genocide more efficient, less burdensome on the killers, and more comprehensive in scope. The regime had already tested mobile gas vans in occupied Poland, suffocating victims with carbon monoxide. But what was needed in the eyes of Nazi planners was a systematic approach that encompassed all of Europe's Jews. Hitler, though rarely giving direct written orders, made clear in speeches and private meetings that the Jewish question had only one solution: annihilation. This shift was not hidden from his inner circle. It was embraced as a historic mission. The year 1941 became the turning point, when war radicalization collided with ideology to produce the machinery of genocide. By winter, plans were underway to transform killing into policy, and policy into law. The drive toward a comprehensive solution emerged from both ideology and pragmatism. Ideologically, Nazi leaders saw themselves as executing Hitler's vision of racial cleansing, eradicating Jews from Europe as an act of destiny. Pragmatically, they faced the challenge of controlling millions of Jews spread across occupied territories, a task impossible through shootings alone. The war created cover for such policies, as the chaos of battle and occupation masked the extent of atrocities. Deportations were already underway, with Jews from Germany and Austria transported eastward into ghettos and camps. But the ghettos were overcrowded, diseased, and unsustainable, revealing the inadequacy of temporary solutions. Officials like Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich began discussing more radical measures, involving mass transport directly to extermination sites. Their bureaucratic mindset sought not improvisation, but structure with timetables, quotas, and coordination across ministries. The fate of millions was reduced to numbers on paper, decisions in offices, and signatures on documents. By autumn 1941, genocide had shifted from possibility to inevitability, awaiting only formal organization. The Wannsee Conference, convened on January 20th, 1942, symbolized this bureaucratic transformation of mass murder into policy. Held in a villa on the shores of Berlin's Wannsee Lake, it gathered 15 senior officials from the SS, ministries, and government agencies. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, presided over the meeting with chilling authority. The purpose was not to decide whether to kill Jews, by then the killing was already underway, but to coordinate how it would be done. Heydrich outlined plans for the deportation of 11 million Jews from across Europe, from France to the Soviet Union, to camps in the East. His presentation treated genocide as an administrative matter, couched in euphemisms like evacuation and special treatment. The participants discussed classifications, exceptions, and logistics, debating how to handle mixed marriages and half-Jews. No one at Wannsee objected to the principle of extermination. The questions were only of efficiency and scope. In just 90 minutes, the meeting codified genocide into the administrative machinery of the state. The villa's serene setting contrasted grotesquely with the barbarity of its agenda. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference, preserved despite Nazi attempts to destroy records, reveal the cold precision of the discussion. Known as the Wannsee Protocol, the document listed the Jewish populations of Europe country by country, reducing millions of lives to statistics. France 865,000, the Netherlands 160,000, Hungary 742,800. Even neutral nations like Switzerland and Ireland appeared on the list, evidence of the Nazis' continental ambitions. The document made clear that no Jewish community was beyond reach, whether under German occupation or in Allied states. Its language was deliberately sanitized, avoiding explicit references to murder, yet its intent was unmistakable. Words like evacuation meant deportation to death camps, and special treatment meant extermination. The bureaucrats in attendance accepted this coded language without protest, demonstrating their complicity. Through such documents, genocide was disguised as administration, allowing perpetrators to view themselves as managers rather than killers. In this way, murder was transformed into paperwork, signed off with the banality of office routine. The bureaucratic organization of genocide required coordination across multiple institutions of the Nazi state. The SS oversaw the camps and killing squads, while the Reich Ministry of Transport managed the trains that carried victims to their deaths. The Foreign Office negotiated with Allied and occupied countries to secure Jewish deportations, while economic ministries profited from the seizure of Jewish property. Each branch of government played its part, integrating genocide into the very fabric of state administration. Civil servants, police officers, and railway workers all became participants, often seeing their roles as technical rather than murderous. A train dispatcher arranging deportation schedules may not have fired a bullet, but his work ensured the deaths of thousands. This diffusion of responsibility allowed ordinary people to contribute without confronting the full horror of their actions. The genocide was thus not only the work of fanatics, but of bureaucrats, professionals, and institutions functioning with deadly efficiency. In this machinery, the line between office work and killing blurred until they became indistinguishable. The final solution was not chaos. It was organized, rationalized, and systematized by a modern state. For the Jewish population, the consequences of this planning were immediate and catastrophic. Deportations accelerated, with trains carrying thousands daily from ghettos to extermination camps like Chelmno, Belzec, and Auschwitz. Families were torn apart on platforms, with selections determining who would die immediately and who would endure forced labor. The trains, packed beyond capacity, became mobile prisons where suffocation and starvation claimed lives even before arrival. Inside the ghettos, despair deepened as deportation lists were posted, and families awaited their fate. Rumors spread of death camps, though few could imagine the full scale of industrialized killing. The veneer of legality provided by conferences and decrees masked the reality that these were death sentences. For Jews, the machinery of bureaucracy was no less lethal than bullets. It operated silently, relentlessly, and without pity. Deportations became part of daily life, their regularity as routine as the trains that carried coal or mail. This routinization of genocide reflected the efficiency sought at Wannsee. What had once been unimaginable had become institutionalized as policy. The Radicalization of 1941 and the Wannsee Conference of 1942 revealed the interplay between ideology and administration. Ideology demanded annihilation. Administration made it possible. Without the fervent belief in racial destiny, genocide would not have been conceived. Without the machinery of the state, genocide could not have been executed on such a scale. The Holocaust was not merely the product of hatred, but of a modern bureaucracy harnessed to hatred's service. The killers did not act alone. They were supported by clerks, engineers, railway workers, and civil servants. This collaboration gave genocide a terrifying normality, cloaked in the language of schedules, memos, and statistics. The banality of the process did not lessen its horror, but magnified it, showing how ordinary tools could serve extraordinary evil. By uniting passion with process, the Nazis ensured that genocide would advance inexorably, with little room for hesitation. The final solution was now both a vision and a program, written in ideology and sealed in ink. By the close of the Wannsee Conference, the path to total annihilation was set with terrifying clarity. The meeting confirmed what the shootings and deportations had already foreshadowed, that the Nazi regime intended nothing less than the eradication of the Jewish people. What remained was not the decision itself, but the implementation carried out with ruthless precision. Camps would be built, trains scheduled, resources allocated, and lives extinguished with mechanical efficiency. The veneer of legality and administration gave genocide a facade of order, masking its true barbarity. For the perpetrators, this allowed murder to be rationalized as duty. For the victims, it meant that survival now hinged on a machine designed to erase them. The final solution had moved from rhetoric to reality, from scattered massacres to systemic policy. Wannsee was not the beginning of genocide, but its confirmation, the moment ideology and bureaucracy aligned fully. In the serene villa by the lake, the fate of millions was sealed without a gunshot, without a scream, but with signatures and nods of agreement. From that moment forward, the Holocaust would unfold with chilling inevitability, its course charted in files and carried out in death camps. With the decisions of 1941 and 1942 paving the way, the Nazi regime turned toward the construction of purpose-built extermination camps. Unlike concentration camps, which combined imprisonment with forced labor, these facilities were designed with a single objective: mass murder. They represented the culmination of Nazi ideology, fused with administrative efficiency, transforming genocide into an industrial process. The first of these was Chelmno, established in December 1941 in occupied Poland, where gas vans were used to suffocate victims with carbon monoxide. This method, though crude, marked the shift from shootings to mechanized killing. Soon, new facilities at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were constructed as part of Operation Reinhard, the code name for the annihilation of Polish Jewry. Each camp was placed near railway lines to ensure efficient deportation, their designs deceptively simple yet fatally effective. From the moment of arrival, victims had only hours or sometimes minutes before death. These camps were not prisons or work sites, they were factories of death, designed for throughput, not survival. With their creation, the machinery of mass extermination was fully set in motion. Chelmno became the prototype for extermination through gassing, its methods brutal yet systematic. Jews from surrounding towns were rounded up, herded into the camp, and stripped of belongings before being forced into sealed trucks. The vehicles were modified with hoses that funneled exhaust fumes directly into the compartments, turning transport into execution. Victims screamed, clawed at walls, and collapsed as carbon monoxide suffocated them within minutes. Once dead, their bodies were driven into forests and dumped into mass graves. Over time, as the number of corpses grew, cremation pits replaced burial, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. Chelmno demonstrated that killing could be mechanized, reducing the need for face-to-face shootings. It also showed the psychological convenience for perpetrators, who no longer had to fire bullets into terrified victims. Though crude in method, it paved the way for the far larger killing centers to come. In Chelmno's fields and forests, the first true blueprint for extermination camps was written in blood and smoke. The establishment of Belzec in March 1942 marked the beginning of Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. Located in southeastern Poland, Belzec was built with a singular purpose to annihilate Jews deported from nearby ghettos. The camp's design was deceptively small, yet its efficiency was staggering. Victims arrived by train, were ordered to undress in holding areas, and told they were being sent to showers. Instead, they were funneled down narrow pathways. The tube, as guards called it, toward gas chambers disguised as bathhouses. Carbon monoxide from stationary engines was piped into sealed rooms, killing hundreds at a time. Within months, tens of thousands perished, their bodies buried in pits or burned when decomposition overwhelmed the camp. Belzec killed an estimated 600,000 people in less than a year, making it one of the deadliest sites of the Holocaust despite its short operation. Its existence demonstrated how rapidly extermination could be scaled up when bureaucracy, ideology, and technology converged. Belzec was not just a camp, it was a slaughterhouse engineered for speed. Sobibor, another Reinhard camp, followed Belzec's blueprint but refined its methods of deception. Established in May 1942, it lured victims with signs and structures mimicking train stations and bathhouses designed to calm them until the final moment. SS officers and guards assured new arrivals they were simply being resettled, even instructing them to label luggage for future collection. In reality, these belongings were immediately looted, sorted, and sent to Germany. Victims, stripped of everything, including their hair, which was harvested for industrial use, were marched to gas chambers fueled by exhaust engines. Thousands died each day in silence, their screams muffled by thick walls. Despite the overwhelming death, Sobibor became the site of one of the most famous uprisings, when prisoners in 1943 killed guards and staged a mass escape. Though most were recaptured or killed, the revolt symbolized defiance even in the face of certain death. The Nazis responded by dismantling the camp, ploughing over the site, and planting trees to conceal evidence. Yet the earth itself held memory, and Sobibor's soil bore witness to the annihilation of more than 200,000 lives. In Sobibor, murder was refined into routine, its efficiency cloaked in lies. The deadliest of the Reinhard camps was Treblinka, established in July 1942. Unlike labor camps, Treblinka's design left no space for survival. Its sole function was extermination. Trains arrived daily, each carrying thousands crammed into cattle cars, many already dead from suffocation or thirst. Upon arrival, victims were told they were being deloused, a cruel euphemism for imminent death. Within hours, they were stripped, driven into gas chambers, and murdered with carbon monoxide. Corpses piled up in staggering numbers, initially buried in mass graves, but later exhumed and burned to conceal evidence. Treblinka's throughput was horrifying. At its peak, over 10,000 people were killed in a single day. In just over a year, nearly 900,000 Jews were annihilated within its barbed wire. Few survived to tell the story, but those who did spoke of endless trains, choking chambers, and smoke that never stopped rising. Treblinka became the epitome of industrial genocide, a place where life expectancy was measured in hours. Its name would forever stand as a synonym for annihilation. While the Reinhard camps operated in occupied Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau emerged as the largest and most infamous killing center of the Holocaust. Originally a concentration and labor camp, Auschwitz expanded in 1942 to include extermination facilities capable of killing on an industrial scale. Unlike Treblinka or Belzec, Auschwitz combined forced labor with mass murder, making it both a camp of exploitation and annihilation. Here, experiments with Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, replaced carbon monoxide as the primary killing method. Crystals of Zyklon B were dropped into sealed chambers, releasing lethal gas that suffocated thousands in minutes. The gas chambers were paired with crematoria, where bodies were burned in furnaces designed for continuous operation. Auschwitz became the central hub of the final solution, with deportees arriving from across Europe, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Greece, and beyond. Selections on the ramp determined who would live temporarily as laborers and who would die immediately. The scale was staggering. Over 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were murdered at Auschwitz. It was the machinery of death perfected, combining deception, labor, and annihilation into one monstrous complex. The machinery of extermination extended beyond camps to the logistics of transport and disposal. Trains, operated by ordinary railway workers, became arteries of death, carrying victims from ghettos to camps in endless convoys. Schedules were meticulously planned, with timetables listing human cargo alongside coal and freight. Upon arrival, belongings were confiscated, sorted, and shipped back to Germany, where they entered the economy as spoils of genocide. Gold teeth were extracted from corpses, hair was collected for use in textiles, and clothing was redistributed. Nothing was wasted. Death itself became commodified. The process was so organized that the murder of millions resembled an assembly line, efficient and impersonal. Bureaucrats filed reports, accountants balanced ledgers, and engineers maintained crematoria, all while human beings vanished into smoke. The camps became symbols of modernity corrupted, where technology and administration were wielded in the service of annihilation. In this machinery, human life was not simply devalued, it was rendered meaningless. Death became routine, mechanized, and disturbingly ordinary for those who carried it out. The creation of extermination camps marked the full realization of the final solution, where ideology, technology, and bureaucracy converged into genocide. Each camp functioned as a cog in the greater machinery of death, designed for speed, concealment, and totality. Victims were deceived until their final breaths, stripped not only of life but of dignity, identity, and memory. The scale of killing defied comprehension, with millions annihilated in carefully orchestrated operations. Unlike the chaos of shootings, extermination camps delivered death with chilling regularity, reducing genocide to procedure. For perpetrators, this mechanization created distance, allowing them to commit atrocities without confronting their victims directly. For the world, the camps became the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust, their ruins standing as silent memorials to horror. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz were not aberrations but the logical outcome of Nazi ideology. They were the culmination of years of radicalization, planning, and dehumanization, where hatred found its most destructive form. In their chimneys and graves, the machinery of death revealed the darkest capability of modern civilization. The name Auschwitz has become synonymous with the Holocaust, a place where industrialized murder reached its most terrifying perfection. Located in occupied Poland, it began in 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, but its purpose rapidly evolved. By 1942, Auschwitz had expanded into a vast complex that included the notorious subcamp Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II. Here, the Nazis constructed gas chambers and crematoria on a scale unprecedented in human history. The site sprawled across miles of barracks, fences, watchtowers, and rail lines, a self-contained city of death. At its peak, the complex included Auschwitz II Birkenau and Auschwitz III Monowitz, alongside dozens of satellite camps. Each part served a role in the Nazi program, from forced labor to immediate extermination. The sheer size of Auschwitz made it unique, allowing it to function as both a killing center and a reservoir of slave labor. Deportation trains from across Europe arrived daily, delivering men, women, and children into its machinery. For those who entered, Auschwitz was rarely a temporary station. Most never emerged alive. The expansion of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942 turned the camp into the central hub of the final solution. Construction crews, often composed of prisoners, built massive gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, along with crematoria capable of burning thousands of bodies daily. These structures operated with chilling efficiency, integrating killing and disposal into a seamless process. Victims were herded into changing rooms, ordered to undress, and told to remember the numbers of their pegs for the return of clothing they would never see again. From there they were funneled into gas chambers, sealed with heavy doors, where Zyklon B crystals were poured through vents. Within minutes the rooms filled with cyanide gas, suffocating entire groups of men, women, and children together. Afterward, Sonderkommando prisoners, themselves doomed, were forced to remove corpses, extract gold teeth, and prepare bodies for burning. Ashes were dumped into rivers, fields, or used as fertilizer, erasing even the trace of those murdered. This mechanization transformed death into a continuous cycle, day and night, without pause. At Auschwitz, extermination was not chaos but routine, a process perfected with deadly regularity. The arrival of trains at Auschwitz-Birkenau was the beginning of horror for hundreds of thousands. Packed into cattle cars for days without food, water, or sanitation, many deportees died en route. Survivors who stumbled out of the wagons found themselves standing on the infamous selection ramp. SS doctors, with a flick of the wrist or nod of the head, decided who would live and who would die. Young men and women deemed fit for labor were sent to barracks, while the elderly, sick, children, and mothers with infants were directed toward the gas chambers. Families were torn apart in minutes, with parents and children separated under the barking orders of guards. Many victims had no idea what awaited them, still clutching luggage or comforting their children with promises of reunion. For those sent to the left, the end came within hours of arrival. For those sent to the right, survival meant enslavement, hunger, and brutality, with death always hovering close. The selection ramp was a place where humanity was stripped away in an instant, replaced by a system that treated lives as disposable inventory. For those chosen for labor, life in Auschwitz was a slow death under conditions of unimaginable cruelty. Prisoners were tattooed with numbers, their identities reduced to ink on skin, erasing names and histories. Daily existence was defined by hunger, exhaustion, and violence, as work assignments ranged from construction to industrial labor for companies like IG Farben. The Monowitz subcamp, known as Buna, became a hub of slave labor where prisoners toiled under brutal conditions for German industry. Barracks were overcrowded, infested with lice, and filled with the stench of disease and despair. Roll calls lasted for hours, often in freezing temperatures, with beatings and executions carried out for the smallest infractions. Rations consisted of watery soup and stale bread, insufficient to sustain even minimal strength. Starvation was constant, and disease claimed lives by the thousands, often faster than the brutality of guards. Hope evaporated in the daily grind of suffering, as survival became a matter of chance rather than resilience. For laborers, Auschwitz was not escape from death, but a postponement of it. The industrial scale of murder at Auschwitz reached its peak in 1944, with the deportations from Hungary. In just a few months, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to the camp in one of the most intense killing operations of the Holocaust. Trains arrived daily, disgorging thousands who were processed with terrifying speed. The gas chambers operated at maximum capacity, with crematoria working around the clock to dispose of the bodies. When even the furnaces could not keep up, open-air pits were dug, where corpses were burned in massive pyres that sent smoke billowing across the countryside. The stench of burning flesh hung over nearby towns, impossible to ignore yet met with silence or complicity. For the Nazis, this represented efficiency. For victims, it was annihilation on a scale beyond comprehension. Auschwitz had become the epicenter of genocide, the final destination for Jews from across Europe. The Hungarian deportations demonstrated both the logistical might and the inhuman cruelty of the camp system. In those months, Auschwitz was transformed into a vortex of death unparalleled in history. The role of Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to assist in the process of extermination, added another layer of horror to Auschwitz. These men were compelled to guide victims into gas chambers, remove corpses, and operate crematoria under constant SS supervision. They lived isolated from other prisoners, marked for eventual execution to erase witnesses to the atrocities. Despite their forced role, many documented what they saw, burying notes and testimonies in the ground as acts of defiance and remembrance. Their writings describe the sounds of suffocation, the sight of lifeless children, and the overwhelming despair of their tasks. Some Sonderkommandos staged revolts, most notably in October 1944, when they blew up one of the crematoria with smuggled explosives. Though the uprising was crushed, it remains a powerful symbol of resistance against impossible odds. The Sonderkommandos embodied both the depths of Nazi cruelty and the resilience of human dignity under duress. Their testimonies later provided crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the killings. In Auschwitz, even the act of survival was entangled in the machinery of death. The deception employed at Auschwitz highlighted the Nazis' obsession with control and concealment. Victims were told they were being resettled for work, their belongings carefully collected and catalogued to maintain the illusion. Signs marked baths and disinfection adorned gas chamber entrances, encouraging compliance until the final moment. Prisoners were ordered to tie their shoes together, label luggage, and keep belongings neat, reinforcing the lie that they would retrieve them later. Music sometimes played near the chambers to mask screams, while guards barked orders with cold precision. The deception ensured that chaos was minimized and resistance rare, allowing the machinery of death to function smoothly. Meanwhile, confiscated possessions flowed into the German economy, clothing redistributed, valuables melted down, hair woven into textiles. The plunder of Auschwitz was as systematic as the killing itself, turning genocide into both extermination and profit. Victims entered believing they were beginning new lives. In reality, they were stepping into their graves. The cruelty of deception compounded the physical horror, making betrayal the final indignity. By the time Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945, it had claimed the lives of over 1.1 million people, the vast majority of them Jews. The camp had become the epitome of Nazi barbarity, a site where modern technology and bureaucracy were harnessed to extinguish life on an industrial scale. Its ruins, crematoria blown up by retreating Nazis, could not erase the evidence of mass murder found in ashes, belongings, and skeletal survivors. For the world, Auschwitz became the enduring symbol of the Holocaust, encapsulating both its scale and its cruelty. It demonstrated how ideology, when fused with modern systems, could produce killing as efficient as manufacturing. The camp's legacy endures not only in history books, but in the silence of its grounds, where visitors today walk among ruins and memorials. Auschwitz was not just a place of death, it was the embodiment of a worldview that sought to erase an entire people. Its name is now inseparable from the word genocide, a warning carved into human memory. The factory of death revealed the darkest possibilities of human civilization. In its shadows, the world was forced to confront the abyss. Life inside the Nazi camps was defined by a relentless routine of dehumanization that stripped individuals of dignity, identity, and hope. Upon arrival, prisoners were tattooed with numbers, replacing names with digits that reduced them to inventory within the Nazi system. Hair was shaved, belongings confiscated, and uniforms issued, transforming men, women, and children into indistinguishable figures in striped clothing. The camp was a world governed by sirens, orders, and violence, where every movement was regulated and every misstep punished. Days began before dawn, with prisoners dragged from overcrowded barracks into freezing or sweltering roll calls that often lasted for hours. Those too weak to stand were beaten or killed on the spot, their deaths serving as examples to others. The barracks themselves were wooden shells, crammed with bunks where disease spread unchecked and privacy vanished. Hunger gnawed constantly, as rations consisted of watery soup, crusts of bread, and thin coffee substitute, never enough to sustain survival. Starvation was not incidental but deliberate, a tool to weaken bodies and break spirits. From the very first day, the camp routine was designed not to sustain life, but to erase it. The daily schedule revolved around forced labor, which was both exhausting and deadly. Prisoners were divided into work details, assigned tasks ranging from construction to factory work, quarrying, or agricultural labor. Hours stretched endlessly, often in extreme weather, with guards beating those who lagged behind. The labor was not chosen for productivity alone, but for cruelty, designed to exhaust bodies already weakened by hunger and disease. Many collapsed under the strain, their corpses carted away before the day was done. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens profited from this exploitation, using prisoners as disposable workers in their factories. Those deemed too weak or unfit were quickly selected for extermination, their labor potential extinguished along with their lives. This cycle of work and death created a chilling efficiency, The camp functioned as both a factory of labor and a conveyor belt to annihilation. Prisoners learned quickly that survival depended on endurance, cunning, and sometimes sheer chance. Every day at labor was a test of will against a system designed for destruction. Starvation was the ever-present companion of camp life, eroding strength and willpower with each passing day. Rations were deliberately inadequate, designed to weaken and kill through slow attrition. A prisoner's daily diet rarely exceeded 1,000 calories, far below the needs of those forced into grueling physical labor. Bread was often moldy, soup was little more than watery broth, and potatoes, when provided, were spoiled or scarce. Hunger dominated every thought, turning meals into moments of desperate calculation and obsession. Prisoners bartered scraps of bread, traded possessions for food, or scavenged for anything edible in the filth of the camp. Starvation also fractured solidarity, as hunger drove some to desperate measures, including theft from fellow inmates. Yet, remarkably, many still shared their rations with the weaker, clinging to humanity even in the face of deprivation. The physical toll of starvation was evident in emaciated bodies, swollen bellies, and hollow eyes that betrayed the suffering within. Hunger was not just a condition but a weapon, wielded by the Nazis to sap strength and extinguish resistance. Brutality was woven into every aspect of the camp, enforced by guards who ruled through violence and terror. SS officers and Kapus, prisoner functionaries often chosen for their ruthlessness, used beatings, whips, and executions to maintain control. Punishments were arbitrary, with infractions as minor as stumbling at roll call resulting in death. Prisoners were hanged in public squares, their bodies left dangling as warnings to others. Whippings, shootings, and savage beatings became part of daily life, carried out with sadistic indifference. Dogs were unleashed on prisoners for the amusement of guards, tearing into flesh while onlookers were forced to watch. Torture chambers and standing cells subjected victims to prolonged agony, pushing many to the brink of death. Violence was not only a method of discipline but an expression of power, reinforcing the complete domination of the SS. For the victims, the constant threat of brutality created a climate of fear that permeated every moment. The camp was not only a prison but a theater of cruelty, where suffering was staged daily for control and intimidation. Disease thrived in the camps, feeding on overcrowding, malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly, claiming thousands of lives in waves of epidemic outbreaks. With medical care absent or deliberately denied, the sick were often left untreated, abandoned to die in their bunks or on the ground. Doctors among the prisoners did what little they could, improvising remedies and tending to the dying with scraps of cloth and makeshift tools. Yet the SS often selected the sick for immediate extermination, regarding them as useless mouths. Hygiene facilities were primitive, with latrines overflowing and lice infestations rampant. In Auschwitz and other camps, pseudo-medical experiments were performed on prisoners, inflicting unimaginable suffering under the guise of science. Victims endured injections of poisons, sterilization procedures, and exposure to diseases for research that served no purpose beyond cruelty. For most prisoners, illness meant certain death, whether through neglect, execution, or experimentation. The combination of hunger, exhaustion, and disease turned bodies into shadows of themselves, fragile vessels barely clinging to existence. The camp was an ecosystem of suffering, where death lurked in every cough, every fever, every weakness. Psychological torment was as devastating as physical suffering, eroding the will to live under constant humiliation and fear. Prisoners were stripped of individuality, reduced to numbers and uniforms, their humanity denied at every step. Families were separated, friendships shattered, and bonds of community deliberately destroyed. The randomness of survival, one day sent to labor, another to the gas chamber, created a sense of helplessness that broke many. Guards exploited this despair, mocking prisoners, staging false hopes, or tormenting them with arbitrary cruelty. The sounds of the camp reinforced the horror, the endless shouting, the barking of dogs, the crack of whips, and the silence of death marches. For many, the greatest struggle was not merely to stay alive, but to preserve some fragment of dignity. Some found strength in prayer, others in acts of kindness, and others still in the determination to bear witness. The psychological wounds endured in the camps often lasted longer than physical scars, haunting survivors for the rest of their lives. In Auschwitz, Dachau, and countless other camps, the torment of the mind was as lethal as the torment of the body. Survival strategies varied, often balancing between luck, ingenuity, and the ability to endure suffering. Prisoners sought better work assignments, such as positions in kitchens or workshops, which offered access to scraps of food or moments of shelter. Connections within the camp, friendships, family ties, or even alliances with capos could mean the difference between life and death. Some clung to routines, reciting prayers, keeping diaries, or singing songs that preserved memory and identity. Others engaged in small acts of resistance, from smuggling food to sabotaging equipment, defying their captors in subtle ways. In the darkest moments, solidarity emerged as prisoners shared rations, protected children, or shielded the weak. Yet survival always came at a cost, often requiring choices that left deep scars of guilt and shame. The randomness of fate, being chosen for labor instead of immediate death, surviving an epidemic, or avoiding a guard's gaze, played a role as well. Those who endured carried memories of both resilience and compromise, haunted by the thin line between survival and annihilation. In the camps, living was never just survival. It was endurance in a world designed to destroy. The daily reality of camp life revealed the Holocaust not only as a program of mass murder, but as a system of sustained dehumanization. Every detail, from the roll calls to the starvation rations, from the forced labor to the constant beatings, was engineered to crush body and spirit. The camps were not merely holding sites for eventual death, but environments where suffering itself became the weapon. The machinery of extermination was complemented by the machinery of despair, each reinforcing the other. Yet within this abyss, fragments of humanity persisted, defying the Nazi effort to erase them completely. Survivors later testified not only to horror, but to moments of compassion, resilience, and solidarity that flickered like fragile flames. These stories remind us that even in places designed to annihilate dignity, the human spirit refused to vanish entirely. The camps exposed both the depths of cruelty and the stubborn endurance of hope. For those inside, life was measured not in days but in moments of survival, one breath to the next. In the daily torment of the camps, genocide was lived minute by minute, hour by hour, until death or liberation arrived. In the suffocating darkness of ghettos and camps, where starvation, disease, and death seemed inescapable, acts of resistance emerged as extraordinary affirmations of life and dignity. Resistance did not always mean armed struggle. It included smuggling food, preserving culture, documenting atrocities, and maintaining faith. Yet, as Nazi policies grew more brutal, underground networks recognized that survival itself required defiance. Leaders in ghettos and camps began organizing in secret, forging alliances, and acquiring weapons despite overwhelming odds. Resistance was a dangerous gamble, punished by torture and execution if discovered, but desperation fueled determination. The knowledge that extermination was inevitable for most spurred many to choose action over waiting for death. For Jews, resistance was not simply about military victory, but about reclaiming humanity in the face of dehumanization. Every act of defiance, however small, declared that Jewish life and spirit could not be completely erased. The ghettos and camps became unlikely battlegrounds, where the oppressed, armed with little more than courage, stood against the most powerful machinery of terror in the world. Resistance, even when doomed, became a legacy of honor and defiance carved into history. The most famous example of Jewish armed resistance was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943. By this time, the Warsaw Ghetto had been systematically emptied, with hundreds of thousands already deported to Treblinka. Those who remained knew their fate. Deportation meant certain death. In response, underground groups such as the Jewish Combat Organization, Shobar, and the Jewish Military Union, ZW, armed themselves with smuggled pistols, rifles, grenades, and even homemade explosives. When German forces entered the ghetto to complete its liquidation, fighters launched a desperate resistance, attacking with surprise and ferocity. For weeks, street battles raged, with Jewish fighters emerging from bunkers and tunnels to ambush soldiers. Though hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, they forced the Nazis into drawn-out combat, delaying their plans. Eventually, the Germans resorted to burning the ghetto block by block, reducing it to ashes. The uprising ended in tragedy, with most fighters killed or captured, yet it resonated as a symbol of courage. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising demonstrated that even in the shadow of annihilation, defiance was possible. Beyond Warsaw, other ghettos also witnessed resistance movements determined to fight rather than submit. In Białystok, a ghetto uprising erupted in August 1943, with Jewish fighters attacking German forces using weapons smuggled through underground networks. Though the rebellion was swiftly crushed, it embodied the determination of Jews to resist deportation. In Vilna, the United Partisan Organization known as the FPO organized sabotage and attacks, eventually leading survivors into forests to join partisan groups. In Częstochowa, Minsk, and other ghettos, similar efforts unfolded, each one a desperate attempt to confront overwhelming power. These uprisings rarely succeeded militarily, but they carried immense symbolic weight. They challenged the stereotype of Jewish passivity, proving that resistance existed wherever survival was threatened. Fighters often knew they would die, but they chose to meet death with weapons in hand rather than in gas chambers. These rebellions also inspired hope among other oppressed communities, showing that even against the most merciless regime, resistance was possible. In the ghettos of Eastern Europe, flames of defiance flickered amidst the ashes of despair. Each uprising, however brief, testified to a refusal to be erased silently. Resistance extended beyond the ghettos into the very heart of extermination camps, where rebellion seemed impossible. At Treblinka in August 1943, prisoners secretly gathered weapons, cut communication lines, and staged a revolt. Hundreds stormed the gates, some setting fires to camp structures, while others attacked guards with stolen rifles and grenades. In the chaos, about 200 prisoners escaped into nearby forests, though most were later recaptured or killed. Similarly, at Sobibor in October 1943, Jewish prisoners orchestrated one of the most daring escapes of the Holocaust. Led by Soviet POW Alexander Paczerski and Polish Jewish fighters, they assassinated SS officers and overpowered guards. Amid the uprising, nearly 300 prisoners broke through barbed wire and minefields, fleeing into the woods. Though many were hunted down, dozens survived to join partisan groups, and bear witness after the war. These uprisings forced the Nazis to dismantle Treblinka and Sobibor, fearing further revolts. Even in death factories, where survival seemed unthinkable, Jews rose against their captors with bravery that defied imagination. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, resistance emerged, despite the crushing conditions of industrialized extermination. In October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando staged a revolt, smuggling explosives from a munitions factory operated by female prisoners. With these weapons, they blew up Crematorium 4, temporarily halting the machinery of death. The uprising was quickly suppressed, and nearly all participants were executed. But the act demonstrated extraordinary courage. Women such as Rosa Rabota, Esther Weichblum, and Arla Gertner, who risked everything to smuggle explosives, were tortured and hanged for their role. Their sacrifice highlighted the crucial part women played in resistance, often overlooked in broader narratives. Even in Auschwitz, where death hovered constantly, Jews found ways to strike back. The rebellion did not stop the killings, but it shattered the myth that victims went quietly to their fate. It became a final testament that even within the heart of darkness, defiance burned fiercely. Auschwitz's uprising, though crushed, remains one of the most poignant examples of resistance born in hell itself. It proved that humanity, though battered, could never be fully extinguished. Underground networks were vital to these acts of resistance, operating in secrecy under constant threat of exposure. In ghettos, clandestine organizations published newspapers, spread news from the outside world, and coordinated smuggling operations. In camps, secret committees organized sabotage, forged documents, and plotted escapes. Weapons were smuggled in through bribery, stolen from guards, or manufactured from scraps. Radios and hidden couriers kept hope alive by sharing news of Allied advances. Resistance groups also forged links with non-Jewish partisans in forests, joining broader movements against German occupation. These connections provided arms, intelligence, and sometimes shelter for escapees. Every message, every smuggled bullet, and every shared secret carried the risk of death if discovered. Yet without these networks, uprisings like Warsaw or Sobibor would never have been possible. They were the invisible lifelines of defiance, sustaining the will to resist under unimaginable oppression. Resistance also took quieter, less visible forms, equally vital in the struggle to preserve dignity. Secret schools kept children educated, even if only in cramped rooms lit by candlelight. Rabbis and community leaders organized clandestine prayer services, defying Nazi bans on religion. Artists, writers, and musicians created works in the ghettos and camps, preserving culture in the face of destruction. The Ringelblum archive in Warsaw, buried in milk cans and metal boxes, documented daily life with extraordinary detail. Teachers wrote textbooks in hiding, while doctors secretly recorded medical data on starvation and disease. Mothers told stories and lullabies to children, shielding them as best they could from despair. These cultural and spiritual acts were forms of resistance that asserted humanity against dehumanization. They reminded both victims and oppressors that Jewish identity could not be annihilated completely. Even in the silence of starvation and the shadow of death, memory and culture endured. Resistance was not only a matter of weapons but of will, expressed in every act of defiance, large or small. Though most uprisings ended in death, their legacy endures as some of the most powerful symbols of the Holocaust. Fighters in ghettos and camps knew they could not defeat the Nazis militarily, but they sought to leave a mark of dignity on history. Their defiance inspired survivors and shocked perpetrators, proving that even the most oppressed could strike back. These acts also preserved memory, ensuring that the world would know Jews did not go silently to their deaths. Testimonies of survivors carried these stories forward, shaping post-war understanding of resistance during genocide. In Warsaw, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz, courage erupted in places designed for annihilation. Each act of resistance, however brief, revealed the unbreakable human spirit in the face of overwhelming terror. They were not victories of arms, but victories of will, etched into history as proof of resilience. Resistance and revolt became legacies passed on by the few who survived to tell the tale. In the ghettos and camps, amidst despair, defiance rose like a flame that refused to be extinguished. The machinery of the Holocaust could not have functioned without the widespread participation and compliance of individuals far beyond the SS elite. While the architects of genocide sat in Berlin, its execution depended on local collaborators, police forces, and bureaucrats across occupied Europe. From France to Lithuania, from the Netherlands to Hungary, ordinary institutions of state power became instruments of Nazi policy. Local police rounded up Jews, guarded trains, and enforced anti-Jewish decrees, often with zeal that exceeded German expectations. In villages and towns, neighbors identified Jewish families, betraying them to authorities in exchange for property, money, or favor. Collaboration was not merely coerced, but frequently voluntary, reflecting deep veins of anti-Semitism already present across the continent. Bureaucrats filed paperwork, stamped passports, and processed deportation orders, turning genocide into an administrative routine. Teachers, mayors, and clerks adjusted their roles seamlessly, serving the regime without questioning its goals. The Holocaust was thus not only a German project, but a European one, facilitated by the cooperation of countless hands. Collaboration became the silent partner of destruction, woven into the daily operations of genocide. In countries under direct German occupation, local police forces became essential enforcers of Nazi racial policy. In France, the Vichy regime cooperated willingly, with French police organizing mass roundups like the Val d'Affy raid of July 1942, where over 13,000 Jews, including children, were confined in appalling conditions before deportation to Auschwitz. In the Netherlands, Dutch police assisted in the systematic arrest of Jews, contributing to one of the highest deportation rates in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, collaboration was even more pronounced, as auxiliary police units composed of Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Latvians participated directly in mass shootings. These forces often rounded up Jews for the Einsatzgruppen, guarded ghettos, and even carried out executions themselves. Their knowledge of local geography made them indispensable to Nazi efficiency, as they identified hiding places and resistance networks. Collaboration was fueled by anti-Semitism, opportunism, and sometimes sheer survival, but its consequences were the same: lives destroyed and communities annihilated. Without local enforcers, German forces alone could not have achieved such swift and comprehensive destruction. The police baton, whether wielded by German or local hands, became an extension of Nazi ideology. In their complicity, ordinary institutions of law became instruments of genocide. Bureaucrats, clerks, and administrators also played a critical role, often far from the killing fields. They issued decrees, processed deportation orders, and maintained the flow of paperwork that kept trains moving to the death camps. Railway officials scheduled transports with precision, listing human cargo alongside coal and freight, reducing millions to lines in a ledger. Tax offices confiscated Jewish property, transferring homes, businesses, and savings to Aryan owners or the state. Municipal clerks registered Jewish identities, stamped documents, and enforced segregation laws with bureaucratic efficiency. To many, these tasks seemed routine, mere functions of office work, yet they were integral to genocide. The Holocaust depended on this administrative infrastructure, where extermination was advanced with pens, stamps, and files as much as with guns and gas. Bureaucrats rarely witnessed the killings, yet their decisions sealed fates with chilling detachment. This diffusion of responsibility made complicity easy to hide, cloaking atrocity in the language of procedure. In the Nazi system, even the desk and typewriter became weapons of destruction. Genocide was not only committed in forests and camps, it was also written in ink. Industry and corporations profited immensely from the Holocaust, integrating forced labor into their operations. German giants such as IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, and Daimler-Benz exploited camp prisoners to produce chemicals, weapons, and machinery. Auschwitz's Monowitz camp, also known as Buna, was built specifically to supply IG Farben with cheap slave labor for synthetic rubber and fuel production. Prisoners worked under brutal conditions, collapsing at machines while companies recorded profits. These corporations were not passive participants. They actively lobbied for access to labor, knowing it meant the exploitation of human beings destined to die. Other industries, from rail companies like the Deutsche Reichsbahn to clothing manufacturers, profited from the confiscated belongings of deported Jews. Gold fillings extracted from corpses were melted down and deposited in Reichsbank accounts, merging murder with financial gain. The Holocaust became not only a program of extermination, but an economy of plunder, enriching businesses that thrived on suffering. Corporate complicity gave genocide a material dimension, embedding it within the fabric of commerce. The pursuit of profit and the pursuit of death marched side by side in Nazi Germany. Industry's silence was paid for in blood. Even outside formal institutions, ordinary Germans contributed to or benefited from the persecution of Jews. Neighbors reported families to the Gestapo, motivated by suspicion, envy, or the promise of reward. Businesses acquired Jewish-owned shops at discounted prices after forced sales, while families moved into confiscated apartments once their former occupants were deported. The belongings of deported Jews were auctioned off publicly, their possessions dispersed among communities that watched their neighbors vanish. Many Germans turned a blind eye to the disappearance of entire families, telling themselves they did not know where the trains led. Yet the smoke rising from camps like Auschwitz and the whispers that traveled across towns made ignorance implausible. Silence became complicity, a choice to look away rather than confront the horror. For those who questioned, Nazi propaganda offered convenient lies about resettlement in the East. But the emptiness of Jewish neighborhoods and the constant presence of propaganda revealed the truth to anyone who dared to see. Ordinary Germans, through participation, profit, or silence, became part of the Holocaust's web. The genocide was sustained not only by killers, but by the passivity of millions. Collaboration extended into occupied countries, where antisemitism was already entrenched. In Romania, the regime of Ion Antonescu carried out its own mass killings of Jews, particularly in territories like Transnistria, where massacres claimed hundreds of thousands. In Slovakia, puppet authorities cooperated in deportations, often paying Germany to remove their Jewish populations. In Hungary, under Admiral Hervey, the regime initially resisted, but later facilitated deportations, leading to the swift destruction of Hungarian Jewry in 1944. Across the Balkans, Croatia's fascist Ustaše carried out genocidal campaigns with enthusiasm, operating their own death camps like Jasenovac. Collaboration was not simply German coercion, but active participation rooted in local politics, nationalism, and prejudice. Some governments sought to ingratiate themselves with Berlin by aligning with its racial policies. Others exploited the opportunity to rid themselves of long-standing Jewish communities under the cover of war. These collaborations demonstrated that the Holocaust was not confined to Germany's will alone, but echoed across Europe. The final solution became a continental crime, facilitated by allies and local regimes eager to participate. In their complicity, entire nations shared in the burden of guilt. Not all participation came from malice. Some collaborators acted from fear, survival, or opportunism. The Nazi system left little room for neutrality, forcing individuals to choose between complicity and punishment. Some joined local police units or acted as informants to protect their families, while others seized the chance to settle old grudges by denouncing Jewish neighbors. Yet regardless of motive, the effect was the same. Jews were hunted, rounded up, and destroyed with devastating efficiency. The moral spectrum blurred in the fog of occupation, but the result was an immense collaboration that made genocide possible. Historians emphasize that the Holocaust was not only the work of fanatics, but of ordinary people acting within extraordinary circumstances. Their participation was not always ideological, but often practical, shaped by self-interest and fear. This complexity does not absolve, but instead reveals the fragility of morality under tyranny. When the structures of law and community collapsed, betrayal and complicity filled the void. Resistance existed, but complicity was far more common, and its impact was catastrophic. The Holocaust's legacy of collaboration and complicity forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior. Genocide required not only leaders issuing commands, but countless individuals carrying them out, profiting from them, or choosing silence. It was sustained by police who enforced laws, bureaucrats who filed papers, corporations that exploited labor, and neighbors who looked away. This diffusion of responsibility allowed many to claim ignorance or denial after the war, yet their fingerprints remained on the machinery of death. The Holocaust revealed how easily ordinary institutions could be corrupted, how everyday people could become enablers of atrocity. It was not only an event of German history, but a continental collaboration, drawing in governments, industries, and citizens across Europe. Understanding this complicity is essential, for it shows that genocide is not only born in ideology, but thrives in silence and opportunism. Collaboration turned prejudice into policy, and policy into extermination, spreading guilt far beyond the SS. In the story of the Holocaust, the killers were many, but so too were those who allowed killing to happen. The web of complicity remains a haunting reminder that evil requires not only executioners, but also bystanders. The machinery of the final solution spread its reach across Europe through the systematic deportation of Jews from every corner of the continent. Trains became the arteries of genocide, transporting human beings from homes, synagogues, and neighborhoods to ghettos and extermination camps. Deportations began with deception, as families were told they were being resettled for labor in the East. Notices ordered Jews to assemble at train stations, bringing limited belongings, often a suitcase, sometimes a small parcel of food, believing they were embarking on a journey of relocation. In reality, these trains carried them to camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where annihilation awaited. From France to the Netherlands, from Greece to Hungary, Jewish communities were rounded up by local police and Nazi officials working in coordination. The trains, often composed of sealed cattle cars, became prisons of suffocation and despair long before reaching their destinations. Families packed inside endured days without water, food, or sanitation, their cries echoing through the darkness of wooden walls. Many never survived the journey, their bodies discarded upon arrival. Deportation thus became the bridge between Jewish life in Europe and Jewish death in the camps. In France, the Vichy regime's collaboration enabled the deportation of over 75,000 Jews, many of them French citizens. the infamous Ville de Hiv roundup in July 1942, demonstrated the extent of French complicity. French police, not German soldiers, arrested more than 13,000 Jews in Paris, including 4,000 children, and confined them in the Vélodrome de Hiver sports arena under inhumane conditions. Families were left for days without food, water, or medical care before being transported to Drancy transit camp. From there, they were loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz, where nearly all were murdered upon arrival. The French state's involvement exposed how Nazi policies depended on local collaboration to achieve efficiency. Many neighbors looked on silently, some seizing Jewish apartments and businesses once they were emptied. For those deported, betrayal was doubly painful, not only by occupiers but by their own government and fellow citizens. The Ville de Hiv became a lasting scar on French history, a symbol of national complicity in genocide. France's deportations revealed how swiftly the machinery of extermination could infiltrate even democratic nations under occupation. In the Netherlands, the deportations were carried out with ruthless efficiency, aided by meticulous Dutch bureaucratic records, with civil registries detailing Jewish identities, addresses, and professions. The Nazis easily identified targets. Between 1942 and 1944, more than 100,000 Dutch Jews, nearly 75% of the community, were deported, one of the highest proportions in Western Europe. Families like that of Anne Frank went into hiding, but most were eventually discovered and sent to camps. Deportations were often staged from the Westerbork transit camp, where trains departed weekly to Auschwitz and Sobibor. The process was methodical, with Dutch railway workers operating trains on schedule, treating human cargo as routine freight. While some resisted or helped Jews hide, many others complied, their silence enabling the destruction of neighbors. The efficiency of the deportations reflected a society where bureaucracy and order were weaponized against its own citizens. By the time the war ended, the once vibrant Dutch Jewish community was almost entirely erased. The Netherlands became an example of how administrative precision could transform into genocidal efficiency. The deportations extended southward into Greece, where Jewish communities with ancient roots were uprooted and destroyed. In Thessaloniki, once known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans, over 45,000 Jews were forced onto trains bound for Auschwitz in 1943. The journey from Greece to Poland lasted nearly 2 weeks, with passengers crammed into cattle cars without food or water. Many perished along the way, their bodies thrown out during stops or left in the cars to rot beside the living. Those who survived arrived in Auschwitz exhausted, dehydrated, and weakened, making them immediate candidates for the gas chambers. Greek Jews, largely unaware of the extermination awaiting them, often believed they were being relocated for work. Instead, within hours of arrival, entire families were annihilated. The destruction of Greek Jewry illustrated the global reach of Nazi deportations, stretching across thousands of miles to deliver victims to camps in Poland. Communities that had flourished for centuries, deeply woven into Mediterranean culture, vanished in weeks. The deportations from Greece epitomized the cruelty of distance, where long journeys became death marches on rails. The most devastating deportations unfolded in Hungary during the spring and summer of 1944. After the German occupation in March, Adolf Eichmann and his team implemented the final solution with terrifying speed. In just 2 months, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were rounded up and deported to Auschwitz, the fastest deportation campaign of the Holocaust. Trains left daily, packed with men, women, and children from villages and towns across the countryside. The process was organized with military precision, aided by Hungarian gendarmes who carried out arrests and escorted victims to the trains. Entire communities disappeared in days, their homes looted and synagogues abandoned. The deportations overwhelmed Auschwitz, forcing the use of open-air cremation pits when crematoria could not keep pace. For Hungary's Jews, centuries of history ended in a matter of weeks, erasing one of Europe's largest and most vibrant Jewish populations. The scale and speed of the Hungarian deportations shocked even some Nazi officials with their efficiency. This campaign revealed how swiftly genocide could unfold once state power aligned fully with Nazi objectives. Hungary's deportations marked the crescendo of the final solution's fury. The conditions of transport themselves were lethal, transforming deportation into a journey of suffering. Cattle cars designed for livestock were crammed with 80 to 100 people, leaving no space to sit or breathe. Windows were barred, doors sealed, and only a bucket provided for sanitation. Heat in the summer and cold in the winter turned these cars into furnaces or freezers. Prisoners fainted, suffocated, or died of thirst during journeys that lasted days or even weeks. The cries of children echoed in the darkness, while the sick collapsed in corners, unnoticed or unattended. Survivors recalled the unbearable stench, the silence of the dying, and the despair of not knowing their destination. Guards accompanying the trains often showed no pity, sometimes beating or shooting those who tried to escape. For many, the train ride itself became a death sentence, ending before the camp was even reached. Deportation was not only a logistical process but a weapon, killing victims even as it delivered them to extermination. For Jewish communities, deportations felt like betrayal on every level, by governments, neighbors, and sometimes even leaders forced into impossible choices. Jewish councils, or Judenräte, were often compelled by the Nazis to organize lists and oversee deportations, believing cooperation might spare lives. In reality, these councils were caught in an impossible trap, their compliance exploited to facilitate destruction. Neighbors, once friends and colleagues, often remained silent or even took possession of Jewish homes after deportations. In occupied countries, police and civil servants executed orders with little resistance, ensuring deportations ran smoothly. For Jews, the betrayal was devastating, compounding the trauma of exile with the knowledge that help rarely came. Families boarded trains surrounded by familiar faces now turned hostile or indifferent. Communities that had thrived for centuries found themselves abandoned in their final hours. The deportations exposed not only the brutality of the Nazis but the complicity of societies that allowed it to happen. The sense of betrayal deepened the wound of loss, leaving survivors haunted by silence as much as violence. By 1945, the deportations had succeeded in uprooting and annihilating Jewish life across Europe, from Paris to Thessaloniki, from Amsterdam to Budapest. The trains left empty streets and abandoned synagogues in their wake. Communities that had flourished for centuries were erased in months, their histories reduced to ashes in crematoria. The deportations were not incidental, but central to the final solution, the logistical backbone that linked occupied towns to death camps. Without the trains, genocide on such a scale would have been impossible. But with them, annihilation became routine. The image of cattle cars packed with families became one of the Holocaust's most enduring symbols, capturing the cruelty of displacement turned into extermination. Survivors later remembered the sound of wheels on tracks, the clatter of doors locking, and the silence that followed as trains disappeared into the horizon. These sounds became the prelude to destruction, echoing across a continent complicit in silence. The deportations stand as one of the most devastating episodes of betrayal in human history. In their shadow, the final solution achieved its reach, carrying death to every corner of Europe. As the machinery of genocide spread across Europe, information about the Holocaust filtered out to the wider world, but the response was muted and inadequate. Reports from diplomats, underground resistance, and escaped prisoners described mass killings, deportations, and the existence of extermination camps. Yet these accounts often struggled to gain credibility, dismissed as exaggerations or wartime propaganda. Governments, weighed down by the scale of global war, hesitated to act decisively on behalf of Jewish victims. The Allies had intelligence from intercepted German communications detailing deportations and massacres, but the revelations remained buried in bureaucracies. Newspapers occasionally printed stories of atrocities, yet they were often placed deep within pages, overshadowed by military developments. For many, the sheer scale of murder seemed unimaginable, beyond the capacity of belief. This disbelief became a shield, allowing leaders and citizens alike to avoid confronting the truth. The silence of the world was not only ignorance, but also a failure of imagination and responsibility. In this vacuum, the Nazis continued their extermination, unchallenged by meaningful intervention. One of the earliest sources of information came from Polish underground networks, which risked everything to smuggle reports to London. Figures such as Jan Karski, a courier for the Polish resistance, witnessed firsthand the horrors of ghettos and camps. Disguised, he entered the Warsaw Ghetto and later a transit camp, gathering details of Jewish suffering and extermination. In 1942, he delivered his testimony to Allied leaders, including British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and even US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Despite his vivid accounts, including descriptions of gas chambers, his warnings were met with skepticism or silence. Officials acknowledged the tragedy, but insisted military victory remained the only solution. Karski later recalled with anguish how leaders seemed unwilling to grasp the urgency of Jewish annihilation. His mission, though heroic, exposed the gulf between knowledge and action. While information circulated, it did not translate into policy that might have slowed the killing. The cries carried across borders were heard, but too often dismissed as echoes of war. By 1942, the systematic nature of the Holocaust was no longer a secret. The Regner telegram, sent by World Jewish Congress representative Gerhard Regner, warned of Hitler's plan to exterminate European Jewry. Based on information from German industrial sources, it described the intention to kill millions in camps using poison gas. Initially dismissed as implausible, the telegram was eventually confirmed by other reports. That December, the Allies issued a joint declaration condemning the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. Yet the declaration, though historic, lacked concrete action. It was a statement without strategy, a recognition without rescue. Governments did not adjust immigration quotas, did not bomb transport lines, and did not open safe havens. The announcement reassured the public that something was being acknowledged, but it did little to alter the fate of those already in trains and camps. Words were plentiful, but deeds remained scarce. For Jews in Europe, this silence of action was as deadly as the silence of disbelief. Knowledge existed, but intervention never followed. The question of refugees revealed the limits of global compassion. Before the war, conferences like Evian in 1938 had already demonstrated the world's reluctance to admit Jewish refugees fleeing Germany and Austria. Most nations, including the United States and Britain, kept immigration quotas low, citing economic hardship, unemployment, and even anti-Semitic attitudes within their own populations. During the war, these restrictions persisted, despite mounting evidence of genocide. Ships carrying Jewish refugees, such as the infamous MS St. Louis in 1939, were turned away from American and Canadian shores, forcing passengers back to Europe, where many later perished. Neutral nations like Switzerland and Sweden admitted some Jews, but often reluctantly and in small numbers. Britain restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, fearing Arab opposition, even as European Jews faced annihilation. The refusal to provide safe haven meant that millions were trapped, unable to escape the Nazi net, even when survival depended on flight. Refugee policies exposed a grim truth. The world knew, but it did not open its doors. Borders became barriers, sealing the fate of countless lives. In this indifference, genocide thrived. Military options to disrupt the Holocaust were also debated, but largely rejected. Calls to bomb Auschwitz, or the railway lines leading to extermination camps, reached Allied leaders as early as 1944. Survivors and resistance networks pleaded for intervention, believing that strikes could slow or halt the killing. Yet military planners argued that such actions would divert resources from the broader war effort. They insisted victory on the battlefield was the only path to save the Jews, ignoring the daily death toll mounting in gas chambers. When the Allies did bomb areas near Auschwitz, including industrial targets, they avoided striking the crematoria or gas chambers, despite knowing their locations. The refusal to act revealed both caution and indifference, a decision that left the machinery of death running without disruption. Historians have long debated whether bombing could have saved lives, but what remains undeniable is the absence of serious effort. For prisoners, the sight of Allied bombers overhead gave fleeting hope that never materialized into salvation. The silence of the skies mirrored the silence of the world. It was a silence measured in lives lost by the millions. Neutral nations, too, walked a fine line between humanitarian gestures and complicity through inaction. Sweden provided refuge to Danish Jews in 1943, when an extraordinary rescue mission ferried nearly 7,000 across the sea in fishing boats. This act of courage showed that intervention was possible when governments chose action over silence. Yet other neutrals, like Switzerland, admitted refugees only reluctantly, often turning away those without proper documents. Switzerland profited from Nazi gold and banking transactions, indirectly sustaining the regime while claiming neutrality. The Vatican, though informed of atrocities, offered only cautious statements, prioritizing diplomatic neutrality over direct condemnation of genocide. Ireland and Spain remained largely silent, offering little refuge or resistance. The patchwork of responses revealed a world unwilling to prioritize Jewish lives amidst geopolitical calculations. For every Denmark that acted decisively, there were multiple nations that hesitated, calculated, or ignored. Silence became the default, with rare exceptions shining only brighter against a backdrop of indifference. Neutrality, in practice, often meant abandonment. Public opinion in Allied nations reflected a troubling mixture of sympathy, ignorance, and anti-Semitism. In the United States, polls during the war showed widespread opposition to increasing immigration quotas for Jews, even after news of mass killings emerged. Newspapers like the New York Times covered the Holocaust, but often minimized or buried reports deep within their pages. Many citizens focused on their own sacrifices and struggles during wartime, paid little attention to the plight of Jews overseas. Anti-Semitic stereotypes persisted, framing Jews as outsiders or competitors rather than victims of genocide. In Britain, sympathy existed, but rarely translated into political pressure for greater action. The scale of suffering remained abstract, distant, and often doubted by ordinary readers. When stories of gas chambers emerged, some dismissed them as exaggerations, echoing propaganda from World War I. The failure of public pressure allowed governments to maintain restrictive policies without significant opposition. In this climate of disbelief and prejudice, silence reigned, The Holocaust unfolded not only because of Nazi brutality, but because the world did not demand intervention. The silence of the world during the Holocaust remains one of history's darkest indictments. Information existed, testimonies were given, and evidence was available, yet the response was limited to words without deeds. Borders stayed closed, immigration quotas stayed low, and military strategies stayed unchanged. Neutral nations protected their interests, while Allied governments prioritized victory over immediate rescue. This silence was not absolute ignorance, but a conscious failure to act with urgency. For the Jews of Europe, the absence of global intervention meant isolation in their final hours. The world's refusal to confront genocide as it happened allowed the Nazis to carry out their plans with little external disruption. After the war, many would express shock at the revelations of camps and mass graves, but the silence during the war cannot be erased. The Holocaust revealed not only the depths of Nazi cruelty, but the limits of human compassion when tested. In the silence of the world, millions perished unheard, abandoned, and betrayed. As the tide of war turned in 1944, and the Red Army advanced deep into Eastern Europe, the Nazi regime faced the imminent collapse of its empire of camps. Determined to prevent prisoners from falling into Allied hands, the SS ordered the evacuation of thousands from Auschwitz, Dachau, Stutthof, and countless other camps. What followed became known as the Death Marches, forced evacuations carried out under brutal conditions that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Prisoners were driven from their barracks at gunpoint, given little or no food, and forced to march for miles in freezing winter or scorching cold. Those too weak to continue were shot where they fell, their bodies left along the roadsides. Columns of skeletal figures stretched for miles, guarded by SS units determined to keep them moving. Villagers watched as these columns passed, some offering food in secret while others remained silent or hostile. The marches were not logistical necessities, but deliberate acts of cruelty designed to prolong suffering until the very end. For many prisoners, liberation was only a rumor on the horizon. The present was still defined by terror. The death marches became the final chapter of Nazi brutality, a last attempt to conceal crimes and destroy lives. The evacuation of Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1945 marked one of the most infamous of these marches. With Soviet forces closing in, approximately 60,000 prisoners were forced to leave the camp in temperatures far below freezing. Barefoot, clad in thin striped uniforms, and weakened by starvation, they were ordered to march westward. Anyone who stumbled was executed immediately, their bodies littering the snow like grim markers of the journey. Survivors later recalled the sound of gunfire echoing through the night, as guards methodically shot the fallen. Along the way, villagers sometimes witnessed the columns, but fear of reprisal kept most from intervening. For days, prisoners marched with little food, sleeping in barns or open fields, exposed to the elements. Thousands died before reaching their destinations, their corpses frozen into the landscape. The Auschwitz Death March epitomized the cruelty of the SS, who chose suffering over surrender, annihilation over mercy. It was a final act of vengeance against lives already broken. From camps across the collapsing Reich, similar marches unfolded with the same brutality. Prisoners from Stutthof were forced into the bitter cold of the Baltic winter, trudging through snowstorms toward the interior of Germany. At Dachau, 7,000 prisoners were marched southward in April 1945, with only a fraction surviving to see liberation. In Buchenwald, thousands were sent on grueling treks toward Bavaria, collapsing along the roads. These evacuations were not coordinated rescues, but chaotic, violent movements meant to empty camps, before liberators arrived. Guards, themselves desperate and fearful, vented their rage on prisoners, beating, shooting, and starving them along the way. Civilians often encountered these columns, but reactions varied, from small gestures of pity to indifference, and sometimes even cruelty. The marches traversed hundreds of miles, leaving trails of corpses across Germany and Eastern Europe. Survivors described them as death on the road, where every step carried the possibility of execution. For the Nazis, the marches were both an attempt to cover evidence and to continue their war against the Jews until the last moment. In the chaos of defeat, cruelty remained the only constant. The conditions of the marches were deliberately calculated to destroy those already weakened by years of imprisonment. Prisoners were denied adequate clothing, shoes, or blankets, even as temperatures plunged to deadly lows. Food rations were non-existent or pitifully small, sometimes a crust of bread or a potato shared among several people. Water was rarely provided, forcing prisoners to drink from ditches, puddles, or melting snow. The sick and elderly stood no chance, collapsing within hours of departure, their deaths swift and merciless. Even the young and strong faltered after days of ceaseless marching, their bodies broken by exhaustion. The SS showed no mercy, executing anyone who slowed the column. Survivors remembered the roads lined with corpses, frozen in grotesque positions, silent witnesses to the brutality. At night, prisoners huddled together in barns or fields, exposed to wind and snow, knowing the next day would bring the same ordeal. The marches were not only journeys of death, but of despair, erasing hope with every step. Survival meant enduring conditions designed to make life impossible. The death marches also reflected the collapsing order of the Nazi regime. Guards were often disorganized, uncertain of destinations, leading prisoners in circles or abandoning them mid-route. Some columns wandered aimlessly, caught between advancing Allied armies, their suffering prolonged by confusion. In certain cases, local civilians exploited the chaos, attacking prisoners or looting the few possessions they carried. Yet in rare instances, villagers risked their lives to pass bread, water, or shelter to the marching columns. Such acts of kindness, though extraordinary, could not alter the overwhelming cruelty of the system. For the SS, the marches served both symbolic and practical purposes to prevent liberation of witnesses and to demonstrate continued dominance. Even as the right collapsed, they clung to their ideology, ensuring Jews and other prisoners remained targets of destruction. The marches revealed not only logistical desperation, but the persistence of genocidal hatred. In the ruins of war, the Nazi obsession with annihilation endured. The road itself became an extension of the camp, a moving stage for death. For survivors, the death marches were among the most traumatic experiences of the Holocaust, compounding years of suffering with one final ordeal. Those who endured described the unbearable hunger, the gnawing thirst, and the freezing nights when bodies lay beside them in silent death. They spoke of the mental torment of watching friends collapse, powerless to help for fear of being shot themselves. Some found strength in solidarity, sharing scraps of food or holding one another upright during the march. Others survived through sheer willpower, clinging to the faint hope of liberation that lay beyond the horizon. The marches became tests of endurance beyond human limits, where every step was both agony and defiance. Memories of the sound of boots, the crack of rifles, and the endless roads haunted survivors for decades after. Even liberation brought no relief from the images etched into their minds. The death marches left scars not only on bodies, but on souls, deep wounds that never fully healed. For those who lived, survival was both a miracle and a burden. The death marches also revealed the world's proximity to atrocity as liberation approached. Allied troops advancing into Germany often stumbled upon columns of emaciated prisoners. Shocked by the scale of suffering, soldiers described the horror of encountering skeletal figures in striped uniforms, barely able to walk, their eyes hollow with despair. In some cases, liberators engaged SS guards in combat, freeing prisoners on the spot. Yet for many, help came too late, as thousands perished in the final days or hours of the marches. The sight of bodies strewn along roads testified to the senseless cruelty of the retreat. Villagers, confronted with evidence they could no longer deny, stood face to face with the atrocities that had passed their doorsteps. The death marches thus forced a reckoning, bringing the reality of genocide into the heart of Europe. Liberation revealed not only the survivors, but also the magnitude of loss left along the highways of death. These roads, once ordinary paths of commerce and travel, had become corridors of annihilation. The world could no longer claim ignorance when the evidence lay in ditches and fields. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, the death marches claimed the lives of more than 250,000 prisoners. They symbolized the final cruelty of a regime unwilling to relinquish its obsession with extermination, even in defeat. For the SS, the marches were both practical evacuations and acts of vengeance, prolonging suffering until the last possible moment. For the victims, they were a final ordeal, endured on shattered bodies and broken spirits. The marches left trails of corpses across Europe, silent monuments to Nazi barbarity. When liberation finally came, survivors emerged not only from camps, but from roads, fields, and forests, bearing witness to this last phase of genocide. The death marches stand as a reminder that cruelty did not diminish as the regime collapsed, but intensified in its final hours. They exposed the depths of hatred that drove the Holocaust to its bitter end. In their footsteps, history traces the resilience of those who survived and the tragedy of those who did not. The death marches were the Holocaust's last gasp, a moving graveyard that shadowed Europe until the guns of liberation silenced it. As the Axis powers crumbled in 1944 and 1945, advancing Allied armies stumbled upon horrors unlike anything they had imagined. The first major shock came in July 1944, when Soviet troops liberated Majdanek near Lublin in eastern Poland. Unlike other camps, which the Nazis often tried to dismantle, Majdanek was captured largely intact, its barracks, gas chambers, and crematoria still standing. Soviet soldiers discovered piles of shoes, clothing, and human ashes, evidence of the industrial scale of killing. Survivors, emaciated and weak, emerged from barracks that reeked of disease and death. The Soviets invited international journalists to witness the sight, showing the world proof of atrocities that had long been dismissed as rumors. For the first time, evidence of extermination was undeniable, etched in the camp structures and the faces of its victims. Majdanek revealed the scale of Nazi crimes months before Auschwitz would fall. The liberation of this camp was both a rescue and a revelation, exposing genocide in its rawest form. The shockwaves it sent across the world were only the beginning. On January 27, 1945, the Red Army reached Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and deadliest of all Nazi camps. What they found stunned even hardened soldiers, accustomed to the brutality of the Eastern Front. Approximately 7,000 prisoners remained, too weak or sick to be evacuated during the death marches. Their skeletal frames, hollow eyes, and whispered voices embodied years of starvation and torment. The liberators discovered warehouses filled with human hair, suitcases, eyeglasses, and shoes, an inventory of lives extinguished. Crematoria stood in ruins, destroyed by retreating Nazis attempting to erase evidence, but the ash-filled pits and scorched remains spoke clearly. Survivors wept as soldiers entered, some too frail to comprehend freedom after so much suffering. Soviet troops, hardened by years of war, broke down at the sight of children reduced to skin and bone. Auschwitz became the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust, where liberation meant both survival and the burden of testimony. In its silence and ruins, the world finally confronted the abyss of extermination. As Soviet forces swept westward, American and British troops advanced into Germany and Austria, uncovering camps that revealed further dimensions of horror. In April 1945, American soldiers liberated Buchenwald, near Weimar, where more than 20,000 prisoners survived amidst corpses stacked like firewood. The sight overwhelmed even battle-hardened troops who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and across the Rhine. At Dachau, near Munich, Americans entered to find thousands of emaciated prisoners alongside railway cars filled with decomposing bodies. In some cases, enraged soldiers executed SS guards on the spot, unable to contain their fury at the barbarity before them. British forces, meanwhile, reached Bergen-Belsen, where 60,000 survivors languished in a landscape of filth, disease, and death. Piles of unburied corpses filled the camp, while typhus raged among the living, claiming hundreds even after liberation. The liberators faced not only the shock of discovery, but the challenge of saving those who could barely cling to life. These camps were not merely prisons, they were graveyards with survivors still breathing among the dead. Liberation brought relief, but it also brought unbearable scenes that seared themselves into memory. For the Allies, the war's end became entwined with the revelation of genocide. At Bergen-Belsen, the British experienced perhaps the most nightmarish conditions of all. The camp, never designed as an extermination site, had devolved into a cesspool of starvation and disease, as thousands of prisoners were crammed into it from evacuated camps. When British soldiers entered in April 1945, they were confronted with tens of thousands of corpses lying in heaps, many naked, their skeletal bodies twisted in death. Survivors stumbled through the filth, delirious with hunger and disease, too weak to stand or even speak. The stench of decay hung thick in the air, an odor that haunted soldiers for the rest of their lives. Despite desperate efforts, hundreds died each day even after liberation, their bodies too ravaged to recover. The British forced captured SS guards to bury the corpses, making them confront the evidence of crimes they had overseen. Newsreel cameras captured these scenes, bringing the reality of Nazi atrocities into cinemas and living rooms around the world. For the global public, Bergen-Belsen became the face of liberation, an image of horror revealed too late. The camp's liberation was not just a rescue, it was a confrontation with the consequences of silence. In Bergen-Belsen, the world saw death on a scale it could no longer deny. The testimonies of survivors added human voices to the shocking visual evidence of the camps. Men and women, barely able to stand, recounted years of starvation, brutality, and loss. They spoke of families torn apart on arrival, of gas chambers disguised as showers, of daily roll calls that ended in death. Children described watching parents vanish into crematoria, their innocence stolen in moments of terror. These stories, recorded by journalists, soldiers, and investigators, pierced through disbelief, giving names and faces to the faceless numbers. Survivors clung to liberation as both salvation and burden, knowing they must carry memory forward. For many, the joy of freedom was tempered by the realization that entire families and communities were gone. Testimonies became the first drafts of Holocaust history, shaping how the world would understand what had happened. Without them, the evidence of camps might have remained incomprehensible ruins. With them, the Holocaust became undeniable, embedded in words as well as in ruins. Liberation thus gave survivors not only freedom, but the mission of remembrance. The liberators themselves were forever marked by what they saw. Soldiers accustomed to the carnage of battle confessed that nothing prepared them for the camps. Hardened men broke down, writing letters home, describing sights they struggled to put into words. Journalists who entered with the troops reported scenes of horror that stretched beyond imagination, their words often failing to capture the magnitude of suffering. Military chaplains attempted to provide comfort, though they too were overwhelmed by grief and disbelief. Doctors and nurses rushed to treat survivors, but their medical training could not undo years of starvation and disease. Many survivors died in the arms of their liberators, slipping away even as help arrived. For the soldiers, liberation became a defining moment, shaping their understanding of the war they had fought. The Holocaust was no longer an abstraction. It was a landscape of corpses and survivors etched into their memories. These experiences haunted many for the rest of their lives, a burden of witness carried by those who opened the gates. Liberation was both triumph and trauma, victory overshadowed by revelation. The discovery of the camps transformed the global understanding of the Nazi regime. Photographs and film footage of skeletal survivors and heaps of corpses were released to the public, silencing skeptics who had doubted earlier reports. Courtrooms, newspapers, and radio broadcasts echoed with descriptions of atrocities that defied human comprehension. Leaders who had spoken cautiously about Nazi crimes now faced undeniable evidence. The liberation of the camps became a moral turning point, forcing the world to acknowledge genocide as the central crime of the war. Yet the revelation was also too late for millions who had already perished. The scale of destruction ensured that liberation was both a rescue and a memorial, saving a few while standing atop the ashes of many. Survivors, though free, faced the immense task of rebuilding shattered lives in a world that had abandoned them. The camps, once hidden behind barbed wire, now stood exposed to the eyes of humanity. In their ruins, the truth of the Holocaust was laid bare, undeniable, and eternal. Liberation brought light, but it illuminated darkness that would never fade. By the war's end, in May 1945, Allied troops had liberated hundreds of camps, large and small, across Europe. Each site revealed variations of the same horror: starvation, disease, brutality, and death on an unfathomable scale. Majdanek, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and many others became names etched into collective memory. The liberation symbolized the end of Nazi power, but also the beginning of an enduring reckoning. Soldiers who freed the camps carried stories home that shaped post-war narratives, influencing trials, memorials, and historical understanding. For survivors, liberation was a moment of rebirth, yet one shadowed by loss and trauma. The world, confronted with undeniable evidence, could no longer claim ignorance. The images and testimonies ensured that the Holocaust would forever be remembered as humanity's darkest chapter. Liberation did not undo the suffering, but forced recognition of its enormity. In the open gates and silent ruins, history bore witness to both the cruelty of man and the resilience of those who survived. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 left behind not only a continent in ruins, but also a moral reckoning unlike any in history. The liberation of concentration camps had exposed crimes so vast, so systematic, and so horrifying that the world demanded accountability. For the first time, an international tribunal was proposed to hold leaders of a defeated regime legally responsible for crimes against humanity. This was unprecedented, as victors in previous wars had rarely placed the defeated on trial. The Allied powers, United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France, agreed to establish the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany. The choice of Nuremberg was symbolic. Once a proud city of Nazi rallies, it would now become the stage for justice. The tribunal sought to prosecute Nazi officials for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In this way, the world attempted to codify genocide and mass murder into legal categories for the first time. Justice would not erase the atrocities, but it would record them, expose them, and condemn them in the name of humanity. The aftermath of the Holocaust thus gave birth to a new legal and moral order. The Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945, with 22 of the most prominent surviving Nazi leaders placed in the dock. Figures such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Wilhelm Keitel faced charges that included conspiracy to wage aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time, individuals, not just states, were held accountable for atrocities committed during conflict. The courtroom was meticulously documented, with translators, stenographers, and journalists ensuring the world could follow the proceedings. Photographs and film captured images of the defendants, many of whom appeared defiant, resigned, or in denial. Göring, once the second most powerful man in Germany, sought to justify his actions and portray himself as a loyal soldier. Others claimed ignorance or obedience to orders, echoing the defense of just following commands. Yet the evidence presented was overwhelming, including captured Nazi documents, orders, and testimonies from survivors. The trial was both a legal proceeding and a historical record, creating a permanent archive of Nazi crimes. In Nuremberg, the world confronted perpetrators face to face. One of the most powerful elements of the trials was the presentation of documentary evidence that revealed the industrial scale of genocide. Mountains of Nazi paperwork, transport, lists, memos, and orders demonstrated that extermination was not chaotic, but carefully planned and executed. Photographs and films taken by liberating soldiers were shown in court, forcing both the defendants and the public to confront images of mass graves, gas chambers, and starving survivors. The meticulous records kept by the Nazis themselves, once tools of oppression, now became tools of prosecution. These documents made denial impossible, showing signatures and instructions from men now sitting in the dock. Prosecutors emphasized the bureaucratic nature of killing, proving genocide was not the work of rogue individuals, but a coordinated state project. Maps, diagrams, and testimonies painted a picture of systematic destruction carried out with precision. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting the horrifying efficiency of modern civilization turned against humanity. For the world, the evidence transformed abstract accusations into undeniable fact. Nuremberg became not just a trial, but a lesson in the dangers of ideology fused with bureaucracy. Survivor testimonies brought a human voice to the cold documents and photographs. Witnesses recounted their experiences in ghettos, camps, and death marches, their words filling the courtroom with stories of starvation, brutality, and loss. Their voices cracked as they described the gas chambers, the crematoria, and the moments of selection on the ramps at Auschwitz. Some spoke of families torn apart within minutes of arrival, others of years of torment under forced labor and constant fear. The testimonies personalized the statistics, giving names and faces to the millions who had been reduced to numbers. The presence of survivors in the courtroom forced the world to listen directly to the victims, not just the prosecutors. Their courage in reliving trauma under public scrutiny was itself an act of defiance against Nazi efforts to erase memory. Survivors made it impossible to dismiss the Holocaust as fabrication or exaggeration. Their words echoed across history, shaping the way the Holocaust would be remembered. In Nuremberg, the testimony of the few spoke for the silence of the many. The defense strategies of the accused varied, but most attempted to evade responsibility by shifting blame or denying knowledge. Some, like Goering, argued that they had simply followed orders and acted in the service of their country. Others claimed ignorance of the extermination camps, suggesting responsibility lay only with Hitler and Himmler, both dead by 1945. The tribunal, however, rejected these defenses, emphasizing that moral choice remained possible even within dictatorship. The just following orders argument, later known as the Nuremberg defense, became a critical point of debate in international law. Prosecutors insisted that obedience to criminal orders could not absolve individuals of guilt for mass murder. The trials set a precedent that crimes against humanity were universal violations, transcending national laws or military obedience. This principle would influence later tribunals, from Rwanda to The Hague. At Nuremberg, the world declared that individuals could not hide behind state power when committing atrocity. Responsibility, once diffused in bureaucracy, was brought back to the individual. The verdicts delivered in October 1946 reflected the gravity of the crimes. 12 defendants, including Goering, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, were sentenced to death by hanging. Goering, however, cheated the gallows by committing suicide with cyanide the night before his execution. 7 others received long prison sentences, including life terms, while 3 were acquitted, though their reputations remained stained. The executions were carried out swiftly, marking a symbolic act of justice on behalf of millions who could no longer speak. For some, the sentences seemed too lenient, given the scale of suffering. For others, the trials represented a landmark moment of accountability, unprecedented in human history. Never before had leaders of a modern state been judged by an international court for crimes against humanity. The gallows of Nuremberg stood as a warning to future generations that such crimes would not go unpunished. Yet, even in justice, questions lingered about whether punishment could ever equal the magnitude of loss. Nuremberg was both a victory for law and a reminder of its limits. Beyond the main tribunal, a series of subsequent trials extended justice to other perpetrators of the Holocaust. Doctors who had conducted experiments on prisoners, industrialists who profited from forced labor, and judges who enforced Nazi racial laws were all brought to court. The doctors' trial exposed the grotesque medical experiments carried out in camps, from sterilization to hypothermia studies, conducted without consent on helpless prisoners. The industrialist trials revealed the complicity of corporations like IG Farben, which had exploited slave labor and profited from Auschwitz. These cases demonstrated that responsibility for genocide extended beyond political leaders to professionals and businessmen who enabled the system. The trials broadened the understanding of complicity, showing that genocide was not only a political act, but an economic and social one. The Nuremberg process thus became a template for accountability, influencing the development of international criminal law. It laid the foundation for the concept of crimes against humanity as a permanent category of justice. Through these trials, the world learned that every role in genocide, no matter how bureaucratic or indirect, carried responsibility. The Holocaust had implicated not just soldiers, but entire institutions. The aftermath of the Nuremberg trials reshaped both law and memory. They established that genocide and crimes against humanity were not internal matters of a nation, but crimes against all humanity, demanding international accountability. The trials also created an enduring historical record, countering denial with mountains of evidence and testimony. Yet justice was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped, some integrated back into society, and Cold War politics often cut short further prosecutions. Still, Nuremberg stood as a milestone, the first attempt to confront atrocity with law instead of vengeance. It gave survivors a platform to be heard and victims a measure of recognition. The trials also forced the world to grapple with the meaning of complicity, obedience, and morality in times of tyranny. Though they could not heal the wounds of genocide, they planted the seeds of international justice that continue to grow. In their shadow, humanity acknowledged that silence and impunity could never again be acceptable. Nuremberg became both a judgment of the past and a warning to the future. In the ruins of war, it offered a fragile but vital hope for justice. Liberation in 1945 did not bring immediate peace for Holocaust survivors. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new struggle. Those who emerged from camps and hiding places were often skeletal, sick, and without families to return to. Many discovered their homes occupied by strangers, their communities destroyed, and their loved ones murdered. With borders shifting and nations in ruins, survivors became stateless, wandering in search of safety and belonging. The Allied forces established displaced persons, DP camps, where survivors gathered under military administration. These camps, often set up in former German barracks or concentration camp sites, became temporary sanctuaries but were overcrowded and under-resourced. Disease continued to spread, hunger persisted, and despair lingered, as many waited months or years for permanent resettlement. For survivors, liberation was a paradox, freedom from oppression but not yet the security of home. The DP camps symbolized both survival and uncertainty, a liminal space between death and renewal. Here the journey of rebuilding shattered lives truly began. The DP camps, despite their hardships, became centers of resilience where survivors slowly reconstructed their existence. Within these crowded barracks, schools were organized, cultural activities revived, and newspapers printed in Yiddish and Hebrew. Marriages took place, children were born, and communities began to form anew amidst the ruins. Survivors established committees to advocate for their rights and lobbied international authorities for immigration opportunities. Religious services were revived and holidays celebrated, often for the first time in years, giving survivors a sense of continuity with the lives they had lost. Zionist movements gained momentum in the DP camps, as many Jews looked toward Palestine as a potential homeland after Europe had betrayed them. Others sought new lives in the United States, Canada, South America, or Australia, dreaming of escape from the continent that had been their graveyard. The camps were filled with both grief and determination, where tears mingled with the first fragile laughter of renewal. Survivors carried deep scars, but within the DP camps they found strength in solidarity. Out of devastation, communities once again began to grow. Rebuilding individual lives after the Holocaust was an almost unimaginable challenge. Most survivors had lost entire families, their parents, spouses, and children annihilated in ghettos, camps, or shooting fields. Returning to former homes was often impossible, not only because of destruction, but also because neighbors rejected them. Fearful or resentful of their return, some survivors were met with open hostility, even violence, from those who had taken their homes or businesses. In places like Poland, pogroms erupted against returning Jews, most infamously in Kielce in 1946, where dozens of survivors were murdered. This hostility reinforced the sense that Europe remained unsafe, a place of betrayal rather than recovery. Survivors thus faced the trauma of both past and present, the memory of genocide and the reality of ongoing anti-Semitism. For many, rebuilding meant starting entirely anew, often in foreign lands with unfamiliar languages. They carried memories of destruction into every new home, shaping the identities of their families for generations. Reconstruction was not just physical, it was a deeply emotional process, haunted by ghosts of loss. The trauma of survival itself weighed heavily on those who lived. Survivors endured not only physical scars, but also profound psychological wounds. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and survivors' guilt. They struggled with the question of why they lived while others, including loved ones, perished. Silence often became their coping mechanism, as words seemed insufficient to describe the horrors they had witnessed. Some survivors never spoke of their experiences to their children, burying the pain deep within. Others, however, felt compelled to bear witness, giving testimonies to courts, historians, and future generations. The tension between silence and speech defined the survivor experience, shaping family dynamics and collective memory. Trauma manifested in sleepless nights, sudden fears, and enduring sorrow, often invisible to outsiders. Survival was not an end to suffering, but a transformation of it into memory and endurance. The Holocaust lingered not only in history, but in the lives of those who lived through it. Children and orphans of the Holocaust faced particularly daunting challenges in the aftermath. Thousands were left without parents, wandering across Europe in search of relatives who no longer existed. Aid organizations stepped in to care for them, establishing orphanages and support networks in DP camps. Figures like Henrietta Sewell and groups like the Jewish Agency organized efforts to transport orphaned children to Palestine. For many of these children, the trauma of early life was compounded by displacement and uncertainty about identity. Some had been hidden with Christian families or in convents, raised under false names and religions, and now faced the painful process of reintegration. Adoption, reunification, and emigration offered new paths, but the scars of early loss never fully faded. These children became symbols of both tragedy and hope, embodying the future of a people nearly annihilated. Their survival was a miracle, but their lives carried the burden of memory. The fate of orphaned survivors underscored both the cruelty of genocide and the resilience of renewal. Despite unimaginable loss, survivors became the architects of post-war Jewish renewal. Many who emigrated to Palestine participated in the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, bringing their determination and experience to the struggle for nationhood. Others built new communities in North America and beyond, revitalizing Jewish life with traditions carried from destroyed towns and villages. Survivors became leaders in synagogues, schools, and cultural organizations, ensuring continuity in the face of rupture. Their resilience created legacies of strength for their children, often called the second generation, who grew up in the shadow of survival. In rebuilding, survivors honored the memory of those who had perished by creating lives filled with purpose and meaning. Yet the Holocaust remained a constant presence, shaping identities, values, and worldviews. Survivors taught that survival itself was a form of defiance against the Nazis' attempt to erase them. Their voices became central to Holocaust remembrance and education in the decades that followed. Out of devastation, survivors became guardians of memory and builders of renewal. Memory of the Holocaust was not immediate. It unfolded slowly in the post-war years. In the 1940s and 1950s, many societies preferred silence, focusing on rebuilding nations rather than confronting genocide. Survivors often found little audience for their stories, as listeners turned away from the pain or doubted its scale. Yet in time, memory demanded acknowledgement, especially as survivors began to testify in schools, books, and courtrooms. The Eichmann trial in 1961 in Jerusalem became a turning point, broadcasting survivor testimonies to millions worldwide. Their words transformed the Holocaust from an abstract tragedy into lived experience, shaping collective consciousness. Museums, memorials, and archives were created, preserving artifacts, documents, and stories for future generations. Survivor memoirs, like those of Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, and others, gave literary voice to trauma and resilience. Memory became both a personal duty and a global responsibility, ensuring the Holocaust could never be erased. In this way, survivors turned silence into testimony, shaping the moral landscape of the modern world. The legacy of survivors endures not only in memory, but in the lives they rebuilt. They carried forward traditions, raised families, and infused future generations with resilience born of suffering. Their testimonies became the cornerstone of Holocaust education, ensuring that denial and forgetfulness would not prevail. Survivors transformed trauma into teaching, grief into remembrance, and loss into legacy. The DP camps gave way to new homes, the ashes gave way to rebirth, and silence gave way to voices that continue to echo. Yet the Holocaust always remained a wound, a shadow that accompanied survivors wherever they went. Their existence testified to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human endurance. The world owes its knowledge of genocide not only to archives and trials, but to the voices of those who lived. Survivors became bridges between the abyss of history and the conscience of humanity. In their memory, the Holocaust endures as both a warning and a call to preserve life with dignity. The story of survival is the story of remembrance itself. The Holocaust did not end with liberation in 1945. Its echoes have reverberated across generations, shaping history, memory, and conscience. The sheer scale of the final solution forced the world to reckon with evil in ways never before imagined. Nations, communities, and individuals confronted the reality that modern civilization, with its science, bureaucracy, and industry, had been weaponized for genocide. The Nuremberg trials codified crimes against humanity, but justice could never match the enormity of loss. Survivors carried memory into new societies, while scholars, artists, and educators worked to understand the depths of atrocity. Over time, the Holocaust became a central reference point in discussions of morality, law, and human rights. It redefined how the world understood the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and unchecked authority. The legacy of the final solution is not confined to history. It is an ongoing struggle to ensure its lessons endure. Reckoning with this past is not only about remembering what happened, but about understanding how it could happen. In this reckoning, humanity continues to search for meaning in the ashes. Holocaust remembrance became a central pillar of post-war culture, ensuring that the victims were not forgotten. Museums and memorials rose across the world, from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. These institutions preserved artifacts, photographs, testimonies, and documents, creating spaces where memory could be honored and ignorance challenged. Annual days of remembrance, such as Yom HaShoah, provided moments for collective mourning and reflection. Literature and film, from Primo Levi's memoirs to movies like Schindler's List, brought the Holocaust into classrooms, theaters, and homes. Survivors spoke tirelessly in schools, churches, and universities, transforming trauma into testimony. Their voices became bridges between history and present, carrying warnings that hatred must never be allowed to fester again. Commemorations also became acts of resistance against forgetting, ensuring that denial and distortion could not erase truth. The act of remembrance itself became a moral obligation, passed from one generation to the next. In remembering, the world honors the dead and defends the living from repetition. Yet remembrance has always faced the corrosive force of denial. Almost immediately after the war, individuals and groups began spreading lies that minimized or denied the Holocaust. Some claimed the gas chambers were fabrications, others argued the numbers were exaggerated, all in an attempt to absolve Nazis and perpetuate anti-Semitism. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Holocaust denial found new platforms on the internet, spreading falsehoods under the guise of skepticism. Denial is not merely ignorance, it is a deliberate assault on truth, a continuation of the hatred that fueled the genocide. Survivors and scholars responded by preserving evidence with meticulous care, ensuring that archives stood as bulwarks against distortion. Governments criminalized Holocaust denial in some countries, recognizing it as a form of hate speech. Despite these efforts, denial persists, a chilling reminder that memory is fragile and truth must be defended. The fight against denial underscores the importance of education and vigilance in safeguarding history. The Holocaust's legacy includes not only remembrance but resistance to those who would erase it. In this struggle, memory itself becomes a weapon against lies. The final solution also left an indelible mark on international law and human rights. Out of its ashes emerged the Genocide Convention of 1948, defining genocide as a crime under international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted the same year, reflected lessons drawn from Nazi atrocities. These documents sought to establish protections that transcended national borders, recognizing the dignity of every human life. Later tribunals in Rwanda, the Balkans, and elsewhere drew directly on precedents set at Nuremberg. The concept of never again became both a moral rallying cry and a legal framework, though its fulfillment has often been incomplete. The Holocaust demonstrated the necessity of international intervention when states turn against their citizens. It reshaped diplomacy, ethics, and humanitarian policy in profound ways. The legacy of law was imperfect, but it created new tools to confront future atrocities. The final solution, though rooted in destruction, forced humanity to construct new definitions of justice. Its lessons became a foundation for the modern struggle against oppression. The cultural legacy of the Holocaust extends beyond law and memorials into the very fabric of identity for Jews and for humanity as a whole. For Jewish survivors and their descendants, the Holocaust became a defining chapter, shaping community, religion, and politics. The founding of the State of Israel in 1948 was profoundly influenced by the Holocaust, offering a homeland after centuries of exile and persecution. Diaspora communities across the globe carried the weight of memory, embedding it into traditions, prayers, and education. The Holocaust also became a symbol of universal suffering, teaching lessons applicable to all peoples vulnerable to hatred and violence. Artists, poets, and filmmakers grappled with the challenge of representing atrocity, creating works that struggled to balance truth with the limits of language. These cultural efforts kept memory alive, ensuring that the Holocaust was not reduced to numbers but remembered as human tragedy. For Jews and non-Jews alike, it reshaped understandings of evil, resilience, and identity. Culture became another battlefield where memory was preserved against silence. In art and ritual, the Holocaust continues to live. At the same time, the Holocaust's legacy forces uncomfortable reflection on human nature and society. It revealed that genocide was not the product of barbarians on the margins, but of an advanced, cultured nation at the center of Europe. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, and bureaucrats participated in the machinery of extermination, demonstrating how ordinary skills could be corrupted by ideology. Propaganda played a central role, showing how lies repeated often enough could reshape reality and justify hatred. The complicity of bystanders illustrated how silence can be as destructive as action, allowing evil to flourish unchecked. The Holocaust thus serves as a warning about the fragility of morality under pressure. It shows how prejudice, fear, and obedience can transform neighbors into accomplices and institutions into weapons. Its lessons challenge each generation to question authority, resist hatred, and defend the vulnerable. Humanity's capacity for cruelty was revealed alongside its capacity for survival. The Holocaust remains both a mirror and a warning, reflecting the dangers that lurk within society itself. Its legacy demands constant vigilance. Education has become the most vital tool in carrying forward the lessons of the Holocaust. Schools across the world include Holocaust studies in their curricula, teaching students not only history, but also empathy and moral responsibility. Survivors who once stood in classrooms to tell their stories have passed the torch to museums, films, and digital archives as their numbers dwindle. Virtual testimonies and holographic technology now allow future generations to interact with survivor voices, ensuring the dialogue continues even after the last witnesses are gone. Educators stress that learning about the Holocaust is not only about Jews or Germans, but about the human condition itself. It is about recognizing warning signs of intolerance, discrimination, and authoritarianism in any society. Holocaust education serves as both remembrance and prevention, arming young people with the tools to resist hatred in all its forms. The challenge lies in making memory relevant as the past grows more distant. Each generation must find new ways to engage with this history, ensuring it is neither forgotten nor trivialized. Education thus becomes the living legacy of the final solution. It is remembrance turned into action. The legacy of the final solution endures as a profound moral obligation, reminding humanity of both its darkest capacities and its enduring resilience. Long after the last survivors have passed, the memory of genocide will remain in museums, testimonies, laws, and the collective conscience of the world. It compels us to confront denial, resist hatred, and question propaganda wherever it arises. It insists that silence is complicity and that indifference is itself a crime. The Holocaust remains a singular event, yet its lessons are universal. Prejudice can kill, lies can destroy, and ordinary people can become agents of atrocity. At the same time, survival, testimony, and remembrance demonstrate humanity's ability to endure and to rebuild. The final solution's legacy is not only death, but also the determination to protect life with dignity. It is a reminder that never again is not a slogan, but a responsibility carried forward. In its shadow, the world has a chance to honor the dead by safeguarding the living. The legacy of the Holocaust is the legacy of humanity itself, fragile yet capable of learning, remembering, and choosing differently.